Tonight, we're pulling apart the biggest lie in Tolkien's mythology, the idea that the two Dark Lords were cut from the same cloth. Most people assume Sauron is just Morgoth's understudy, the sequel villain, the one who picked up the crown after the original fell. But that assumption hides something extraordinary, because when you actually look at these two beings side by side, what you find is not a master and his copy. What you find is two completely different kinds of evil, two completely different relationships to power, two completely different answers to the question of what happens when a divine being decides that the world belongs to him. One of them wanted to burn the world down, the other wanted to own it. And that difference, the difference between the fire and the cage, between the rebel and the administrator, between the god who bled himself into the earth and the angel who poured himself into a ring. That difference is the key to everything Tolkien was trying to say about the nature of darkness itself. Most people who watch The Lord of the Rings or read the Silmarillion walk away with a simple picture in their heads. Two Dark Lords. One came first. One came second. The first one was bigger, meaner, more powerful. The second one picked up where the first one left off. Same evil, different century. This is wrong. This is fundamentally, deeply, revealingly wrong. And the fact that it is wrong tells us something crucial about Tolkien's understanding of evil, about the way power works, about the difference between the being who wants to destroy the world and the being who wants to run it. Morgoth and Sauron are not two versions of the same villain. Morgoth and Sauron are two completely different kinds of villain, two different psychologies, two different relationships to power, two different relationships to creation, two different failures, two different fears, two different ends. The master and the servant are not interchangeable. The teacher and the student did not learn the same lessons. The first Dark Lord and the second Dark Lord are separated not merely by time, but by nature, by the fundamental architecture of their souls, by the thing that drives them, by the thing that breaks them, by the thing that each of them becomes when the last pretense is stripped away. Tonight I want to show you the gulf between them. I want to show you why Sauron could never have been Morgoth, and why Morgoth could never have been Sauron. I want to trace the line that separates the rebel from the tyrant, the nihilist from the perfectionist, the god who poured himself into the ruin of the world from the angel who poured himself into a ring. This is the story of two Dark Lords who shared a title and shared nothing else. Part 1. The assumption. The assumption is everywhere. The assumption is in the way fans talk about the two Dark Lords, interchangeably, as though Sauron is simply Morgoth's sequel, Morgoth 2.0, the lesser copy of the original. The assumption is in the way adaptations portray them, as variations on a theme, as large and scary followed by slightly less large and scary, as the same menace wearing a different helmet. The assumption is in the shorthand that fans use: Sauron is just Morgoth's lieutenant who took over. As if the relationship were that simple, as if the student merely continued the teacher's lesson plan, as if the lieutenant inherited the general's strategy and executed it without modification. The assumption is wrong. And the assumption matters, because the assumption blinds us to the most interesting thing about Tolkien's mythology, the idea that evil is not monolithic. Evil is not a single force with a single face. Evil has varieties. Evil has subspecies. Evil comes in flavors, and the difference between the flavors is not merely aesthetic but structural. The difference between Morgoth's evil and Sauron's evil is the difference between a wildfire and a prison. The difference between Morgoth's evil and Sauron's evil is the difference between the being who wants to burn the house down and the being who wants to own it. This distinction is Tolkien's great insight about the nature of evil, an insight that most adaptations miss and that most fans overlook. Tolkien does not believe that evil is simple. Tolkien does not believe that all villains want the same thing. Tolkien believes that evil manifests in fundamentally different ways, depending on the nature of the being who chooses it, and that the most dangerous thing about evil is not its strength, but its variety. The most dangerous thing about evil is that it can wear different faces, serve different masters, pursue different goals, and still be evil. Morgoth and Sauron are Tolkien's demonstration of this principle. Two beings, both fallen, both evil, and nothing alike. Part 2. Before the beginning, to understand why they are different, we need to start before the world existed. We need to go back to the Ainulindal, to the music of the Ainur, to the moment when Ilúvatar, the creator of all things, summoned his first creations and invited them to sing. The Ainur are the first beings. The Ainur are created by Ilúvatar's thought, are the divine spirits, the angelic intelligences, the powers that exist before the physical world is made. The Ainur are divided into two orders. The Valar, who are the greater spirits, the gods of Tolkien's mythology, the powers who will shape the world, and the Maiar, who are the lesser spirits, the servants and helpers of the Valar, the angelic assistants who carry out the will of the greater powers. Morgoth is a Valar. Morgoth, Melkor, as he is named before his fall, is one of the Valar. Not merely one of the Valar, Melkor is the mightiest of the Valar. Melkor is the most powerful being that Ilúvatar has created, the spirit with the greatest share of the gifts and powers that Ilúvatar distributed among his first creations. Melkor is, in Tolkien's words, given a share of the powers and knowledge of all the other Valar. Melkor has something of Mandu's mastery of air, something of Ul's mastery of craft, something of Ulmo's understanding of water. Melkor is a composite, a being who contains within himself a portion of every other Valar's domain, a spirit of such vast and varied power that he approaches the Creator in scope, if not in authority. Sauron is a Maiar. Sauron, Mairon as he was first named, a name meaning the admirable, is a servant. Not a god, but a servant of a god. Not a Valar, but a Maiar, a lesser spirit, a being of real but subordinate power, created to assist and to serve the greater powers. Sauron's original master is Ul, the Valar of craft, the smith god, the maker of the physical substance of the world. Sauron serves in Ul's workshops. Sauron learns from Ul's teaching. Sauron absorbs Ul's love of order, of pattern, of the meticulous arrangement of matter into useful and beautiful forms. This is the first difference. The first difference is scale, is the difference between a god and a servant, between a being who participates in the creation of the world and a being who assists in its maintenance. The gap between Morgoth and Sauron is not a gap of degree. The gap is a gap of kind, is the difference between the being who shapes the symphony and the being who plays a part in it, between the architect and the foreman, between the power that moves continents and the power that organizes workshops. Part 3. The scale of ambition. But the difference in scale produces a difference in ambition, and the difference in ambition produces a difference in evil. Morgoth's ambition is unlimited. Morgoth wants what Ilúvatar has. Morgoth wants to create, wants to bring forth new things from his own thought, wants to produce beings and worlds and realities that answer to his will alone. Morgoth's fundamental desire is not to dominate the existing world, but to replace it, to supplant Ilúvatar's creation with his own, to demonstrate that Melkor's vision is superior to the vision that the other Valar followed, to prove that the mightiest of the Ainur should have been the creator rather than the created. Morgoth does not merely want to rule Middle-earth. Morgoth does not merely want to sit on a throne and command obedience. Morgoth wants the imperishable flame itself, wants the power of original creation, the ability to bring forth life from his own thought, the divine prerogative that belongs to Ilúvatar alone. Morgoth's ambition exceeds the boundaries of the world. Morgoth's ambition exceeds the boundaries of possibility. Morgoth reaches for something that the structure of reality does not allow a created being to possess, and the reaching defines everything that follows. Sauron's ambition is limited. Sauron does not want to be Ilúvatar. Sauron does not want to create worlds. Sauron wants something much smaller and much more achievable. Sauron wants to organize the existing world according to his own design. Sauron wants order. Sauron wants efficiency. Sauron wants every piece of the world in its proper place, functioning according to a plan that Sauron has devised, operating with the precision and the predictability that Sauron learned to love in All's workshops. The difference is the difference between megalomania and control. Morgoth is a megalomaniac, a being whose ambition exceeds the boundaries of possibility, who wants something that the structure of reality does not permit, who rages against the limits of his own nature with a fury that ultimately consumes him. Sauron is a controller, a being whose ambition is achievable, who wants something that the structure of reality can accommodate, who pursues his goals with a precision and a patience that Morgoth is incapable of. This is why Sauron is in many ways more dangerous than Morgoth. Morgoth wants the impossible. Sauron wants the possible. Morgoth's ambition defeats itself because Morgoth reaches for something that cannot be grasped. Sauron's ambition can be fulfilled, and that is terrifying, because a villain who can actually achieve his goals is more dangerous than a villain who can never achieve his. Part 4. The music. The music of the Ainur is the creation event, the moment when Ilúvatar invites the Ainur to sing a great music together, a symphony that will become the blueprint for the physical world. Each Ainu sings their part. Each voice contributes to the whole. The music is collaborative, is a collective creative act, a shared composition in which every spirit adds their own theme to the unfolding harmony. Melkor disrupts the music. Melkor, the mightiest of the Ainur, begins to weave his own themes into the symphony, themes that are not part of Ilúvatar's design. Melodies that clash with the harmony, discordant notes that shatter the unity of the composition. Melkor does not merely play his part badly. Melkor actively subverts the music, introduces elements that are foreign to the design, that contradict the intentions of the other singers, that impose Melkor's vision on a composition that was meant to be shared. The disruption is the first evil. The disruption is the original sin of Tolkien's mythology, the moment when a created being places its own vision above the shared vision, when individual will overrides collective creation, when the desire to be the author supplants the willingness to be a participant. Sauron does not disrupt the music. This is the crucial detail, the detail that separates the two Dark Lords at the very beginning. Before the world is made, before evil has a name or a face. Sauron does not sing a discordant note. Sauron does not introduce his own themes into the symphony. Sauron, at this point in the story, is not yet fallen, is still Mairon the Admirable, still the devoted servant of all, still the orderly, talented, admirable spirit who has not yet chosen evil. Sauron's fall comes later. Sauron's fall comes in the world, not before it, comes in the physical reality that the music creates, not in the music itself. Sauron falls because Morgoth offers him something that the Valar do not, the promise of a perfectly ordered world. Sauron falls because Sauron looks at the chaos and the disorder of the physical world, the mess, the unpredictability, the refusal of living things to behave according to plan, and Sauron decides that the solution is not collaboration, but control. The timing of their falls tells us everything. Morgoth falls before the world exists, falls in the abstract, in the music, in the realm of pure thought. Morgoth's evil is ontological, is built into the foundation of the world, is woven into the fabric of reality by the discordant notes that Morgoth sang before the first mountain was raised. Sauron falls after the world exists, falls in the practical, in the physical, in the realm of action and consequence. Sauron's evil is operational, is a response to the problems of the existing world, is a solution to the disorder that Sauron cannot tolerate. Part 5. What Morgoth wanted. Let me be specific about what Morgoth wanted, because Morgoth's desire is stranger and more disturbing than most fans realize. Morgoth did not want to rule the world. This is the fundamental misunderstanding, the assumption that Morgoth is simply a dark king, a tyrant on a throne, a ruler who wants to dominate his subjects. Morgoth is not interested in ruling. Morgoth is not interested in subjects. Morgoth is not interested in the kind of stable, organized, functioning tyranny that Sauron would later build. Morgoth wanted to be Ilúvatar. Morgoth wanted the imperishable flame, the creative fire, the power of true creation, the ability to bring new things into being from nothing. The imperishable flame is the one thing that belongs to Ilúvatar alone. The one power that the Creator did not share with his creations, the one authority that even the mightiest of the Ainur does not possess. Morgoth wanted this power. Morgoth searched for the imperishable flame in the void, searched in the emptiness beyond the world, in the darkness outside creation, hoping to find the creative fire that would make him equal to the Creator. Morgoth never found it. Morgoth never found the imperishable flame. Because the imperishable flame is not a thing that can be found, is not an object or a location or a force that exists independently. The imperishable flame is Ilúvatar. The creative power is the Creator. The fire that Morgoth seeks is not separate from the being who holds it, and the being who holds it is not willing to share. The search itself is revealing. Imagine the mightiest of the Ainur wandering the void, wandering the emptiness outside the world, the darkness beyond creation, searching for a flame that does not exist as a separate thing. The search is futile from the beginning. The search is the first sign of Morgoth's fundamental error, the belief that power can be acquired, that authority can be seized, that the ability to create can be taken from the being who possesses it the way a thief takes gold from a treasury. The failure to find the flame transforms Morgoth. The failure does not humble Morgoth, does not teach Morgoth the lesson that a wiser being would learn, the lesson that some things are beyond the reach of created beings. The failure embitters Morgoth. The failure turns Morgoth's creative desire into destructive rage, turns the longing for the flame into the hatred of everything that the flame has produced. Morgoth cannot create, therefore Morgoth will corrupt. Morgoth cannot bring new things into being, therefore Morgoth will twist the things that already exist. Morgoth cannot be Ilúvatar, therefore Morgoth will destroy everything that Ilúvatar has made. This is Morgoth's psychology, the psychology of the failed creator, the psychology of the being who cannot produce beauty and who therefore hates it, who cannot generate life and who therefore corrupts it, who cannot build and who therefore destroys. Morgoth is not merely evil. Morgoth is disappointed, is cosmically, fundamentally, irreparably disappointed in the universe and in himself, and the disappointment curdles into a hatred that encompasses everything. Sauron would never understand this. Sauron would look at Morgoth's quest for the imperishable flame, and see a waste of time, would see the futile search of a being who does not understand the limits of possibility, who does not recognize the difference between the achievable and the unachievable, who spends energy pursuing the impossible when the possible is sitting right there, waiting to be organized. Part 6. What Sauron wanted. Sauron wanted nothing like this. Sauron's desire is entirely different, is a different category of wanting, a different species of ambition, a different relationship to the world and to the beings who live in it. Sauron wanted order. Sauron, the servant of all, the spirit who learned to love pattern and precision in the workshops of the smith god. Sauron wanted the world to work properly. Sauron wanted efficiency. Sauron wanted systems. Sauron wanted every element of the world arranged according to a plan, a rational plan, a coherent plan, a plan that eliminated waste and chaos and the maddening unpredictability of free will. Tolkien tells us this explicitly. In a letter, Tolkien describes Sauron's original fall as beginning with a genuine desire for order. A desire that is not, in itself, evil. Sauron does not fall because Sauron hates the world. Sauron falls because Sauron loves the idea of a perfectly organized world so much that Sauron is willing to destroy freedom to achieve it. Sauron's evil is not born from hatred, but from love. Love of order, love of system, love of the efficient arrangement of all things according to a rational design. The love of order becomes the tyranny of control. The transition is gradual. The transition is the most human thing about Sauron, is the process by which a valid desire becomes an invalid method, by which a legitimate goal justifies illegitimate means, by which the longing for a better world produces the worst possible world. Sauron begins by wanting order. Sauron ends by demanding obedience. The distance between wanting and demanding is the distance between a reformer and a dictator, and Sauron crosses that distance so gradually, so incrementally, so logically, that the crossing seems natural. Morgoth does not care about order. Morgoth does not care about efficiency. Morgoth does not care about systems or plans or rational arrangements. Morgoth cares about power, about the raw, undirected, purposeless exercise of power for its own sake. Morgoth does not want the world to work. Morgoth does not want the world to function. Morgoth wants the world to kneel, and if the world will not kneel, Morgoth wants the world to burn. The contrast is total. The rebel and the administrator, the arsonist and the architect, the being who wants to tear the world apart and the being who wants to put the world in order. Morgoth and Sauron serve the same darkness, but they serve it for entirely different reasons. Part 7. The nature of their evil. Let me sharpen this, because the distinction between their evils is Tolkien's most sophisticated philosophical achievement. Morgoth's evil is nihilistic. Morgoth's evil proceeds from the desire to unmake, to disassemble, to corrupt, to reduce the created world to chaos and ruin. Morgoth does not want to replace creation with something better. Morgoth does not have a vision for a world that functions according to his design. Morgoth's vision is destruction, is the reduction of all things to nothing, the unmaking of everything that Ilúvatar made, the annihilation of the music that Morgoth could not dominate. Sauron's evil is totalitarian. Sauron's evil proceeds from the desire to control, to manage, to organize, to impose a single will on the diversity of the world. Sauron wants to replace freedom with order, spontaneity with predictability, the chaos of independent wills with the harmony of a single directing intelligence. Sauron's vision is a world that functions perfectly, a world without waste, without disorder, without the mess that free beings produce when they are allowed to make their own choices. The philosophical difference is profound. Morgoth is the enemy of existence itself, the being who hates that things exist, who cannot tolerate the presence of beauty and life and joy in a world that he did not design. Sauron is the enemy of freedom, the being who accepts that things exist but insists that they exist under his control, who tolerates beauty as long as beauty serves his purposes, who permits life as long as life obeys his commands. Tolkien understood this distinction because Tolkien lived through the 20th century. Tolkien watched nihilistic evil and totalitarian evil operate in the real world, watched the desire to destroy and the desire to control produce different kinds of horror. Tolkien is not writing allegory. Tolkien is not mapping Morgoth onto one historical figure and Sauron onto another. But Tolkien is observing that the will to destroy and the will to dominate are different impulses, that they produce different evils, attract different followers, and require different responses. Part 8. How they treated their servants. The difference shows in how they treat the beings who serve them. Morgoth uses his servants. Morgoth treats the beings under his command as expendable, as tools, as resources, as disposable instruments of destruction that can be broken and discarded without consequence. Morgoth does not inspire loyalty. Morgoth inspires fear. The orcs who serve Morgoth serve because they are terrified, because Morgoth's power is so vast and so indifferent that resistance seems futile. The Balrogs who serve Morgoth serve because Morgoth's fall mirrors their own, because they too are fallen Maiar, and Morgoth's rebellion gives their fall a structure and a purpose. But Morgoth does not care about his servants. Morgoth does not invest in their development. Morgoth does not train them, does not promote them, does not build systems of advancement and reward that bind them to his service. Morgoth's army is held together by terror, and by the absence of alternatives, is an army of fear, not of purpose. Sauron cultivates his servants. This is one of the most important differences, one of the details that fans most frequently overlook. Sauron does not merely use his servants. Sauron invests in them. Sauron builds systems of loyalty and obligation that bind his followers to his cause, with ties that are stronger than fear, ties of reward, of advancement, of shared purpose, of the genuine belief that Sauron's victory will produce a better world. The Nazgul are Sauron's masterpiece. The Nazgul, the 9 ringwraiths, the 9 mortal men who accepted Sauron's rings and were consumed by them. The Nazgul are not merely servants. The Nazgul are investments. Sauron did not capture the 9. Sauron recruited them. Sauron offered them power, offered them the rings, offered them extension of life, offered them dominion over their own kingdoms. Sauron gave the 9 something that they wanted, and the giving bound them to Sauron's will more tightly than any chain. Morgoth could never have created the Nazgul. Morgoth does not have the patience for recruitment. Morgoth does not have the subtlety for seduction. Morgoth does not understand the concept of giving someone something valuable in order to control them. Because Morgoth does not give. Morgoth takes. Morgoth's relationship with power is entirely extractive, is the seizure, the theft, the forceful appropriation of everything that Morgoth desires. Sauron's relationship with power is transactional, is the exchange, the deal, the carefully structured arrangement in which both parties receive something and one party receives more than the other realizes. Part 9. The Forge and the Pit. Sauron builds. Morgoth digs. This is perhaps the simplest way to understand the difference. When Sauron wants a stronghold, Sauron builds Barad Dûrka, a tower, a structure, an architectural achievement that rises from the plain of Gorgoroth through the labor of slaves and the skill of a craftsman. Barad Dukha is construction. Barad Dukha is engineering. Barad Dukha is the product of a mind that knows how to make things, that understands materials, understands forces, understands the relationship between design and execution, that produces a building that can stand for centuries. Barad Dukha takes 600 years to build. Think about that number. 600 years of construction, of quarrying stone, of laying foundations, of raising walls and towers and battlements through the patient, sustained, relentless application of labor and skill. 600 years. The construction of Barad-dûr is itself an act of patience, is the kind of sustained, focused, long-term investment that characterizes everything Sauron does. Sauron does not conjure his fortress into being. Sauron builds it, stone by stone, year by year, century by century. When Morgoth wants a stronghold, Morgoth digs Angband, an underground fortress, a vast complex of tunnels and pits and chambers carved into the roots of the Thangorodrim mountains. Angband is not built. Angband is excavated. Angband is a hole, a negative space, a void carved into the substance of the earth by a being who cannot create, but who can remove. Morgoth does not build upward. Morgoth digs downward. Morgoth's architecture is subtraction, is the removal of matter, the creation of emptiness, the hollowing out of the world to make room for darkness. The direction of construction tells you everything. Sauron builds upward, toward the sky, toward the light, toward visibility and prominence, and the display of power. Barad-dûr is a statement. Barad-dûr is a projection of Sauron's will into the landscape, a visible declaration of authority that can be seen for miles. Sauron wants to be seen. Sauron's power is enhanced by visibility, by the knowledge that the eye watches from the tower, that the tower rises above the plain, that the Dark Lord is present and watching and aware. Morgoth digs downward, into the earth, into the dark, into concealment and secrecy, and the hiding of power beneath layers of rock and stone. Angband is invisible from the surface. Angband is hidden. Angband is the burrow of the creature that fears the light, the den of the predator that strikes from darkness and retreats into darkness. The contrast tells us everything about their natures. Sauron, the former servant of all the smith, builds. Sauron creates structures. Sauron produces things: the ring, the tower, the armies, the Nazgul, the systems of espionage and governance that allow his empire to function across vast distances. Sauron is a maker, a corrupt maker, a fallen maker, a maker whose creations serve domination rather than beauty, but a maker nonetheless. Morgoth is not a maker. Morgoth is an unmaker. Morgoth does not produce, Morgoth corrupts. Morgoth does not create orcs, Morgoth twists elves into orcs. Morgoth does not create trolls, Morgoth perverts existing creatures into monstrosities. Morgoth does not create dragons, Morgoth breeds them from lesser beasts, corrupting their forms and their natures to produce weapons of war. Everything that Morgoth makes is made by corruption, by the distortion of something that already exists, by the perversion of something that was originally good, by the twisting of creation rather than the act of creating. Sauron creates the One Ring. The One Ring is an original creation, is something new, something that did not exist before Sauron made it, something that Sauron designed and forged and invested with his own power. The ring is evil. The ring is an instrument of domination. But the ring is also a creation, is the product of craft, of skill, of the genuine creative ability that Sauron inherited from Ol's workshops and that Morgoth never possessed. Part 10. Morgoth's Ring. Here is the deepest and strangest difference between them, the difference that shapes every other difference, that determines how each Dark Lord falls and how each Dark Lord ends. Morgoth pours himself into the world. Tolkien describes this in his late philosophical writings, describes a process by which Morgoth, unable to create, instead invests his own spiritual substance into the corruption of the physical world. Morgoth takes the power that Ilúvatar gave him, the vast godlike power of the mightiest valor, and Morgoth disperses that power into the substance of Arda itself. Morgoth corrupts the matter of the world by infusing it with his own essence. The rock is tinged with Morgoth. The water carries a trace of Morgoth. The very fabric of the physical world absorbs Morgoth's will, Morgoth's malice, Morgoth's fundamental corruption. The process is gradual. The process takes ages, takes the entire span of the years of the trees and the First Age, takes centuries of continuous, constant, relentless expenditure of divine energy. Morgoth does not pour himself into the world in a single act. Morgoth bleeds into the world, leaks into the substance of Arda through every act of corruption, every perversion of matter, every twisting of living things, every darkening of the landscape. The process is like a slow radiation, like the gradual contamination of an environment by a source that emits poison constantly, endlessly, without stopping and without diminishing. Tolkien calls this Morgoth's ring. The term is deliberate, is a direct parallel to Sauron's ring, a conscious comparison between the two Dark Lords and the way each invests his power. But the parallel reveals the contrast. Sauron's ring is an object, a single, specific, identifiable thing that can be found, that can be held, that can be destroyed. Morgoth's ring is the world, is the entire physical planet, the whole of Arda, the complete material creation that the Valar shaped from the vision of the music. The implications are staggering. Sauron's power can be concentrated because Sauron's power is invested in a single object. Destroy the ring, and you destroy Sauron's power. The solution is difficult but conceptually simple. Find the ring, bring it to Mount Doom, throw it in. The quest of the Lord of the Rings is possible because Sauron's evil has a location, has a physical address, a place where it can be confronted and destroyed. Morgoth's power cannot be concentrated because Morgoth's power is invested in everything. You cannot destroy Morgoth's ring without destroying the world. You cannot unmake the corruption that Morgoth has woven into the fabric of reality without unmaking reality itself. Morgoth's evil has no address. Morgoth's evil is diffuse, is everywhere, is in the marrow of the mountains and the depth of the seas and the very substance of the planet. The evil is the world. The world is the evil. The two cannot be separated. This is why the world of Middle-earth is fallen. This is why disease exists, why decay exists, why entropy exists, why the world gradually diminishes and darkens as the ages pass. The diminishment is Morgoth's legacy, is the slow, permanent, irreversible consequence of a god pouring his poison into the foundations of the world. Morgoth is defeated at the end of the First Age. Morgoth is cast into the void. But Morgoth's corruption remains in the rock, remains in the water, remains in the very substance of a world that has been tainted at the molecular level by the malice of the mightiest of the fallen. Every time someone in Middle-earth gets sick, that sickness is, in a sense that Tolkien intends literally, Morgoth's fault. Every time something beautiful decays, every time a good thing crumbles, every time the world proves crueler or harsher than it should be, that cruelty is Morgoth's legacy, is the trace of the divine poison that Morgoth poured into the earth before the sun rose. Part 11. Sauron's Ring. Sauron does the opposite. Sauron does not disperse his power into the world. Sauron concentrates his power into a single object, pours his will, his malice, his creative and destructive energy into one small, round, golden thing. The One Ring is Sauron's genius and Sauron's catastrophe. The ring is genius because the ring works, because the ring actually does what Sauron designed it to do, actually controls the other rings, actually extends Sauron's will across vast distances, actually allows a single intelligence to dominate the wills of thousands. The ring is Sauron's masterpiece of engineering, the most efficient and most effective instrument of domination ever created. A device that converts the creative power of a fallen Maya into a network of control that spans a continent. The ring is also elegant. The ring is simple, is a plain gold band, unadorned when cool, revealing its inscription only when heated. The ring does not look like a weapon. The ring does not look like an instrument of domination. The ring looks like a ring, like a piece of jewelry, like a gift, like an object of beauty. The ring's appearance is part of its design. The ring is meant to be desirable. The ring is meant to be coveted. The ring is meant to attract the hands that will carry it, and the fingers that will wear it, and the wills that will be enslaved by it. Compare the ring to the Iron Crown. The Iron Crown is heavy, dark, crude, painful. The ring is light, golden, elegant, seductive. The Iron Crown announces itself as a weapon. The ring disguises itself as a treasure. The Iron Crown says, "I am power." The ring says, "I am yours." The ring is also Sauron's catastrophe, because the ring can be lost. The ring can be taken. The ring can be carried to a volcano and thrown in. Sauron, the careful planner, the meticulous administrator, the being who loves order and predictability and control, Sauron creates the one vulnerability that a careful planner should never create. Sauron puts all his eggs in one basket. Sauron concentrates his power into a single point of failure, and the single point of failure fails. The contrast with Morgoth is illuminating. Morgoth's investment is indestructible, because Morgoth's investment is diffuse. No one can destroy the world. No one can unmake the physical reality that Morgoth has corrupted. Morgoth's evil survives Morgoth's defeat because Morgoth's evil is everywhere and cannot be targeted. Sauron's investment is destructible because Sauron's investment is concentrated. Someone can destroy the ring. Someone can unmake the single object that contains Sauron's power. Sauron's evil can be targeted, can be located, can be confronted, can be carried to a specific location and destroyed in a specific fire. The irony is devastating. Sauron, the planner, creates a vulnerability. Morgoth, the destroyer, creates an invulnerability. The careful being makes the careless mistake. The reckless being achieves the permanent result. Sauron's order produces his downfall. Morgoth's chaos produces his endurance. Part 12. The process of diminishment. Both Dark Lords diminish. Both Dark Lords lose power over time. But they diminish in entirely different ways, and the difference reveals the difference in their natures. Morgoth diminishes by dispersal. Morgoth's power drains away gradually, constantly, permanently, poured into the corruption of the world, invested in the material substance of Arda, spent on the breeding of monsters and the corrupting of elves, and the 1,000 acts of malice that consume Morgoth's original gifts. Morgoth begins as the mightiest of the Valar, a being of godlike power, capable of reshaping continents and commanding the elements. Morgoth ends as a creature of diminished majesty, still fearsome, still dangerous, still a god in some sense, but reduced, weakened, drained by the centuries of pouring himself into the world. Tolkien describes the diminished Morgoth in striking terms. By the end of the First Age, Morgoth is afraid. The mightiest of the Valar, the being who challenged Ilúvatar himself, who sang discordant notes in the music of the Ainur, who battled Fingolfin in single combat. By the end, Morgoth is a being who hides in his fortress, who sends his servants to fight his wars, who sits on his iron throne and clutches the Silmarils and fears the arrival of the Valar's armies. Morgoth's courage has drained away with his power. Morgoth's boldness has been spent along with his substance. The rebel who defied heaven has become the coward who hides underground. Sauron diminishes by concentration. Sauron does not drain away gradually. Sauron removes a large portion of his power in a single act, pours it into the ring, concentrates it into the one object, reduces himself by choice and by design in order to create the instrument that will extend his control. Sauron's diminishment is voluntary. Sauron's diminishment is strategic. Sauron chooses to weaken himself in order to strengthen his reach. Trades personal power for systemic power, accepts individual vulnerability in exchange for collective control. The difference in diminishment mirrors the difference in character. Morgoth's diminishment is passive, is the gradual, unintended, uncontrolled loss of power that comes from spending without replenishing, from giving without receiving, from pouring your substance into the world without ever getting it back. Morgoth does not choose to diminish. Morgoth does not plan to diminish. Morgoth diminishes because Morgoth's nature drives him to invest everything in destruction, and destruction consumes the investor. Sauron's diminishment is active, is the deliberate, planned, controlled sacrifice of personal power for systemic advantage. Sauron chooses to diminish. Sauron plans to diminish. Sauron diminishes because Sauron's nature drives him to invest strategically, to sacrifice in the short term for gain in the long term, to accept personal cost for structural benefit. Morgoth wastes himself. Sauron invests himself. The reckless and the careful, the spendthrift and the investor. The same word, diminishment, describes two entirely different processes. Part 13. Fear. Morgoth becomes afraid. Sauron does not. This distinction is one of the most telling in Tolkien's mythology, one of the clearest indicators that Morgoth and Sauron are fundamentally different kinds of beings. Morgoth fears the elves. This is not a metaphor. This is not a dramatic exaggeration. Tolkien explicitly tells us that Morgoth fears the elves, fears their beauty, fears their creativity, fears their ability to produce works of wonder that Morgoth cannot produce, and that Morgoth's corruption cannot entirely destroy. Morgoth fears the Noldor in particular, fears the fire and the skill that Fëanor brought to Middle-earth, fears the armies that Fingolfin leads across the grinding ice, fears the kingdoms that the Noldor build in Beleriand. Morgoth fears Fingolfin. When Fingolfin rides to the gates of Angband and challenges Morgoth to single combat, Morgoth does not want to fight. The mightiest of the Valar, the being who should be able to destroy Fingolfin with a thought, does not want to come out. Morgoth hesitates. Morgoth considers refusing. Morgoth is afraid of a single elf standing at his gate. Morgoth eventually fights because his pride will not let him refuse, because his captains are watching, because the shame of refusing would be worse than the risk of fighting. But Morgoth is afraid. The god is afraid of the elf. The duel itself confirms Morgoth's decline. Fingolfin wounds Morgoth, cuts Morgoth's foot with his sword Ringel, draws the blood of a god, inflicts a wound that leaves Morgoth limping for the rest of the First Age. A single elf wounds a Valar. The mightiest being in the world is marked by a mortal blow from a created being. Morgoth wins the duel, brings Grond down on Fingolfin 3 times, crushes the Elf King beneath the hammer of the underworld. But the victory is hollow. The victory is the victory of a being who almost lost to a being who should have been nothing more than an insect. The wound on Morgoth's foot is the physical evidence of his diminishment, the proof that the power drain is real, that the once mighty god has weakened to the point where a single elf can hurt him. Sauron is never described as being afraid of his enemies in this way. Sauron is cautious, is strategic, is careful, is willing to wait and to plan and to prepare before acting. But Sauron's caution is not fear. Sauron's caution is calculation, is the assessment of risk, the weighing of options, the deliberate choice to act at the optimal moment rather than the immediate moment. Sauron does not hide in his tower because Sauron is afraid of Aragorn. Sauron stays in his tower because Sauron's tower is where Sauron's power is most effective. Sauron is concerned about the ring. Sauron watches for the ring with an urgency that borders on obsession. But Sauron's concern about the ring is not the paralyzing, identity-corroding fear that Morgoth feels about the elves. Sauron's concern is practical, is the recognition that the ring is a strategic vulnerability, is the awareness that the destruction of the ring would be a catastrophic event. Sauron's concern is the concern of the general who knows that the enemy possesses a weapon capable of winning the war. It is not the fear of the coward who dreads the sight of his opponent. The difference in courage reveals a difference in psychology. Morgoth becomes afraid because Morgoth's power has drained away, because the god who once challenged heaven has spent his divine substance and has nothing left but the memory of power. Morgoth's fear is the fear of a being who knows that he is weaker than he was, who remembers being stronger, who is haunted by the gap between what he once could do and what he can now accomplish. Sauron does not become afraid, because Sauron's power has not drained away in the same way. Sauron's power is in the ring, is concentrated, is preserved, is available as long as the ring exists. Sauron's relationship with his own power is different from Morgoth's. Sauron has invested his power wisely, has placed it where it can serve him, has arranged his affairs so that his strength is available when he needs it. Sauron is not a diminished god, clutching the last remnants of his former glory. Sauron is a strategic mind operating through an instrument of his own design. Part 14. How they fought. Morgoth fights personally. Sauron fights through systems. Morgoth wears armor. Morgoth carries a weapon, Grond, the hammer of the underworld, the great mace that Morgoth wields in his duel with Fingolfin. Morgoth stands on the battlefield. Morgoth engages physically, clashes with his enemies hand to hand, trades blows, takes wounds. Morgoth's foot is slashed by Fingolfin's sword. Morgoth limps for the rest of the First Age, carries the wound that an elf inflicted on a god, carries the physical evidence of his diminishment. Morgoth fights personally, because Morgoth's power is personal. Morgoth has not created systems that extend his will. Morgoth has not built networks of control that operate in his absence. Morgoth's power is in his body, in his presence, in the direct, immediate, physical exercise of his divine strength. When Morgoth fights as himself, as a being of enormous but diminishing power, wielding a weapon, wearing a crown, standing on his own legs. Sauron almost never fights personally. Sauron fights through proxies, through the Nazgul, through his armies, through the network of rings that extend his will across Middle-earth. Sauron's power is systemic, is distributed through the rings, through the Palantri, through the orcs and the men and the spies and the collaborators who serve Sauron's cause without ever seeing Sauron's face. When Sauron does fight personally, the occasions are rare and the circumstances extraordinary. Sauron fights Finrod Felagund in a contest of songs, a battle of power and will, not of swords. Sauron fights in the fall of Menor, but Sauron's involvement in Menor is primarily deceptive, not martial. Sauron fights in the Last Alliance, stands on the battlefield at the end of the Second Age, and battles Gil-galad and Elendil. But even this physical engagement is an exception, not a pattern. Sauron's preference for systemic power over personal combat is not cowardice. Sauron's preference is efficiency. Why fight personally when you can fight through 9 immortal wraiths who cannot be killed by ordinary weapons? Why stand on a battlefield when you can manipulate the battlefield from a tower? Why risk your person when you can risk your proxies? Morgoth fights personally because Morgoth's nature demands it. Morgoth is a being of raw power, of force, of violence, of the direct application of divine strength to the problems of the world. Morgoth does not delegate because Morgoth cannot delegate. Because Morgoth's power does not work through systems. Because Morgoth's will does not extend through networks. Because Morgoth's nature is immediate and physical and present. Sauron delegates because Sauron's nature demands it. Sauron is a being of structured power, of organization, of control, of the indirect application of intelligence to the problems of the world. Sauron delegates because delegation is how systems work. Because the whole point of building a system is that the system operates without requiring the constant physical presence of its designer. Part 15. Deception? Here is perhaps the starkest contrast of all. Morgoth cannot disguise himself. By the time of the First Age, by the time the Noldor arrive in Middle-earth and the wars of Beleriand begin, Morgoth has lost the ability to change his form. Morgoth is locked into his physical shape, is trapped in the dark, towering, iron-crowned body that he has worn for centuries, unable to shed it, unable to adopt a fair form, unable to disguise his nature behind a beautiful exterior. Morgoth's inability to shapeshift is a consequence of his dispersal. Morgoth has poured so much of his power into the corruption of the world that Morgoth no longer has enough power to maintain the flexibility of form that the Ainur originally possessed. Morgoth is stuck. Morgoth is what he looks like, a dark lord, a shadow, a being of malice whose external appearance matches his internal reality. This is a remarkable situation for the mightiest of the Valar. The being who was once the most powerful spirit in creation. The being who once possessed a share of the powers and knowledge of all the other Valar. This being can no longer do something that any lesser Maya can do without effort. Gandalf can appear as an old man. Sauron can appear as a golden lord. Morgoth can only appear as Morgoth. The loss of form is the physical proof of Morgoth's self-destruction. The visible evidence that the mightiest of the Ainur has spent himself into a state worse than that of his servants. Sauron is the greatest deceiver in the history of Middle-earth. Sauron can change his form. Sauron can appear fair, can adopt beautiful shapes, can present himself as a being of wisdom and generosity and good intentions. Sauron is Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, who comes to the elven smiths of Eregion in a fair form and offers them knowledge. Sauron is the advisor to Celebrimbor, the grandson of Fëanor, who helps the elven smiths forge the rings of power. Sauron is the counselor who manipulates the last king of Menor into challenging the Valar themselves. Sauron maintains this capacity for deception across ages. In the Second Age, Sauron is Anatar. In Menor, Sauron is the captive who becomes the counselor. After Menor, Sauron loses his fair form, loses the ability to appear beautiful, loses the mask of Anatar, but even then, Sauron adapts. In the Third Age, Sauron becomes the necromancer, becomes the anonymous dark presence, the unnamed dread, the being who is feared without being identified. Sauron's deceptions change as Sauron's circumstances change. The constant is the deception itself. the fundamental commitment to operating behind a mask, to presenting a false front, to achieving through misdirection what cannot be achieved through direct confrontation. The contrast is fundamental. Morgoth cannot deceive because Morgoth cannot pretend. Morgoth's evil is visible, is written on his face, is carved into his body, is announced by the darkness that surrounds him and the fear that precedes him. Morgoth does not seduce. Morgoth overwhelms. Morgoth does not persuade. Morgoth compels. Morgoth's relationship with other beings is one of dominance, of force, of terror, of the raw exercise of power that does not require consent. Sauron's primary weapon is deception. Sauron seduces, Sauron persuades, Sauron offers. Sauron presents himself as helpful, as a friend, as a mentor, as a being who wants to assist rather than to dominate. Sauron's relationship with other beings is one of manipulation, of fraud, of the careful construction of false identities and false intentions that lure the victim into the trap before the victim recognizes the trap exists. Morgoth is a monster. Sauron is a con artist. Both are deadly. Both are evil. But the monster and the con artist require entirely different responses, and the being who is prepared for the monster may be completely unprepared for the con artist. Part 16. The Rings of Power. Sauron's greatest achievement, the creation of the Rings of Power, is something that Morgoth could never have accomplished, could never have conceived, could never have understood. The Rings of Power are instruments of seduction. The rings do not compel by force. The rings compel by desire, by offering their bearers something that the bearers genuinely want, by granting real power in exchange for hidden submission, by giving with one hand while taking with the other. The rings are transactional. The rings are contracts. The rings are the most sophisticated instruments of manipulation ever created, devices that bind their victims through their own desire, that enslave through the illusion of empowerment. Think about the sophistication of this. Think about the layers of deception involved. Sauron goes to the elven smiths of a region and offers to help them create rings that will enhance their power. The elves, the most perceptive, the most suspicious, the most experienced beings in Middle-earth when it comes to the recognition of evil, the elves accept Sauron's help. They accept because Sauron presents himself as Anatar, a beautiful emissary of the Valar. They accept because the knowledge Sauron offers is genuine, the techniques work, the craft is real, the skills are valid. They accept because Sauron's deception is not a crude lie, but a sophisticated truth. A truth that conceals a deeper lie. A genuine gift that conceals a hidden trap. The rings that the elven smiths create under Sauron's guidance are genuine works of art and power. And the three rings of the elves, Narya, Nenya, Vilya, are forged by Celebrimbor alone, without Sauron's direct hand in the work, which is why they are the most uncorrupted of the great rings. The three are among the most powerful and most beautiful objects ever created. The rings work. The rings enhance their bearers' powers. The rings preserve and protect. But even the three are connected to Sauron's system, are vulnerable to the One Ring's dominion, because they were made with the techniques that Sauron taught. The fact that the rings are part of a system designed for domination does not negate the fact that the rings are also genuine creations of extraordinary beauty and power. Morgoth could not have created the rings because Morgoth does not understand transactions. Morgoth does not understand exchange. Morgoth does not understand the concept of giving someone something valuable in order to gain something more valuable in return. Morgoth's relationship with power is extractive, is the seizure, the theft, the forceful appropriation of everything that Morgoth desires. Morgoth does not offer rings. Morgoth offers nothing. Morgoth takes. Sauron understands transactions because Sauron understands systems. Sauron understands that the most effective form of control is the control that the controlled person does not recognize. The control that feels like freedom, that looks like empowerment, that presents itself as a gift. The rings are Sauron's administrative genius applied to the problem of domination. The recognition that a slave who believes he is free is a more reliable servant than a slave who knows he is chained. The 9 rings for mortal men are the clearest example. Sauron gives the 9 to kings and warriors and sorcerers, gives them to men of power, men of ambition, men who want more than the ordinary span of mortal life allows. The rings grant what the men desire: power, longevity, influence, the ability to achieve great deeds and to extend their reigns beyond the normal boundaries of mortality. The rings deliver on their promises. The rings actually work. And the working is the trap, because the power the rings grant is power that the ring-bearer cannot surrender. And the longevity the rings provide is longevity that stretches into an eternity of servitude. The men become wraiths. The men become Nazgul. The men become shadows, invisible, deathless, enslaved, bound to Sauron's will by the rings that they accepted freely, destroyed by the gifts that they chose to receive. The Nazgul are not Sauron's prisoners. The Nazgul are Sauron's customers, beings who bought what Sauron was selling and who discovered, too late, that the price was everything. Morgoth's slaves know they are slaves. Sauron's victims don't know they are victims until it's too late. This is the difference between force and fraud, and it is the difference between Morgoth and Sauron at its sharpest and most disturbing. Part 17, Menor. Sauron's greatest deception, the manipulation of Menor, is the achievement that most clearly demonstrates the gulf between the 2 Dark Lords. Sauron is captured. Sauron is brought to Menor in chains, carried across the sea to the greatest civilization of men, the island kingdom that the Valar raised from the ocean as a gift to the Edain. Sauron is a prisoner. Sauron is in the power of Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Menor, the mightiest mortal monarch in the history of Middle-earth. Think about what happens next. Think about the audacity of it. A prisoner, a being in chains, stripped of his armies, separated from his ring, surrounded by enemies, this prisoner proceeds to conquer his captors. Not in a year. Not in a decade. Over the course of decades. Slowly, methodically, one conversation at a time. And Sauron, from his prison, from his chains, from his position of absolute vulnerability, Sauron conquers Menor. Not through force, not through power, not through the exercise of divine strength. Sauron conquers Menor through words, through persuasion, through flattery, through the patient, meticulous, devastatingly effective manipulation of a king whose pride is greater than his wisdom. Sauron begins by being useful. Sauron offers knowledge. Sauron shares craft. Sauron provides counsel that proves accurate, advice that proves sound, insights that prove valuable. Sauron makes himself indispensable, makes himself the being whose counsel the king cannot afford to ignore, whose knowledge the king cannot afford to lose, whose company the king cannot afford to forego. Sauron becomes Ar-Pharazôn's counselor. Sauron becomes the power behind the throne. Sauron, the prisoner, becomes the advisor, becomes the voice that whispers in the king's ear, the intelligence that shapes the king's decisions, the presence that transforms the greatest kingdom of men from a beacon of civilization into a temple of darkness. Sauron introduces Morgoth worship to Menor. Sauron builds a temple, a great temple in which the Enmemrians sacrifice to Morgoth, burning human victims on the altar, offering the lives of the faithful as payment to the Dark Lord in the void. Sauron corrupts the religion of Minor. Sauron corrupts the politics of Minor. Sauron corrupts the culture of Minor. Sauron turns the blessed island into a nightmare, and Sauron does it with nothing but his tongue. Morgoth could never have done this. Morgoth could never have submitted to capture, could never have tolerated the humiliation of chains, could never have accepted the position of prisoner in order to become the position of advisor. Morgoth's pride would not permit it. Morgoth's nature would not allow it. Morgoth would have raged. Morgoth would have fought. Morgoth would have brought down the building around him rather than sit in a cell and plan a long game. The contrast reveals the deepest difference between them. Morgoth is a being of the moment, a being who acts on impulse, who responds to the immediate situation with the full force of his diminished divinity, who cannot restrain himself, who cannot delay, who cannot accept short-term humiliation for long-term advantage. Sauron is a being of the future, a being who plans, who waits, who accepts present suffering for future gain, who understands that the long game is the only game worth playing. Part 18. The Fall of Menor. Sauron convinces Ar-Pharazôn to invade the Blessed Realm. Sauron convinces the mightiest mortal king to challenge the Valar, to sail west with the greatest fleet ever assembled, to set foot on the shores of the Blessed Realm, to attempt by force what no mortal has ever attempted. The invasion is an act of madness. The invasion is the most catastrophic decision in the history of men. The Valar respond by calling upon Ilúvatar himself, and Ilúvatar breaks the world. The flat world is made round. The Blessed Realm is removed from the physical world entirely, lifted out of the circles of the world, placed beyond the reach of mortal ships, hidden behind the straight road that only the elves can travel. Menor is swallowed by the sea. The island sinks. The civilization is destroyed. The greatest achievement of mortal men is erased in a cataclysm that reshapes the fundamental geometry of the planet. And Sauron survives. Sauron's body is destroyed, drowned in the drowning of Menor, killed in the cataclysm that he himself provoked. But Sauron's spirit survives. Sauron's spirit flies back to Middle-earth, flies back to Mordor, back to the ring, back to the instrument that preserves his power. Sauron loses his ability to assume a fair form, loses the gift of disguise that made him the greatest deceiver in the world. But Sauron lives. Sauron endures. Sauron returns. The survival is characteristic. Sauron survives because Sauron has planned for contingencies, because Sauron has placed his power in the ring, because Sauron's system of control does not depend on Sauron's physical body, because Sauron has created a mechanism that preserves his essence even when his form is destroyed. Sauron's survival is not luck. Sauron's survival is engineering, is the product of a mind that thinks ahead, that builds in redundancies, that creates systems robust enough to survive the destruction of their designer. Morgoth does not survive his defeat. When the Valar come for Morgoth at the end of the First Age, when the host of the West breaks Angband and drags Morgoth from his throne, Morgoth is finished. Morgoth does not have a ring. Morgoth does not have a backup. Morgoth does not have a system that preserves his power independently of his person. Morgoth is thrust into the void, and the void holds him because there is nothing left of Morgoth to resist. Because Morgoth has spent his power, has poured his substance into the world, has diminished himself to the point where even the mightiest of the Valar can be thrown out of the world like a troublesome guest. Part 19. Their relationship to creation. Morgoth hates creation. The statement is not figurative. The statement is literal. Morgoth hates the act of creating, hates the products of creation, hates the beings who create, hates the joy that creation produces, hates the beauty that creation generates. Morgoth's hatred of creation is the core of his evil, is the engine that drives every act of corruption, every war, every cruelty. Morgoth cannot create, and the inability has become the definition. Tolkien describes Morgoth's relationship to creation in devastating terms. Morgoth envies the elves because the elves can create. The elves make things, make art, make music, make jewels, make cities, make languages, make the thousand small and large acts of subcreation that Tolkien regards as the defining gift of intelligent beings. Morgoth watches the elves create, and the watching burns him. Burns with the knowledge that these lesser beings, these children of Ilúvatar, possess a gift that the mightiest of the Ainur does not possess. A capacity for genuine originality that Morgoth's fall has stripped from him. Sauron does not hate creation. Sauron uses creation. Sauron creates things, creates the ring, creates Barad-dûchta, creates the political and military structures that govern his empire. Sauron's relationship to creation is not hostile, but instrumental, is the relationship of a manager to his tools, a general to his weapons, a CEO to his organization chart. Sauron creates what serves his purposes and discards what does not. Sauron does not hate the act of making. Sauron harnesses the act of making, bends it to his will, directs it toward his objectives, converts the creative impulse into an instrument of control. The difference matters because the difference determines what each Dark Lord produces. Morgoth's hatred of creation produces only corruption, only the twisting of existing things, only the perversion of beauty into ugliness, only the degradation of what others have made. Morgoth leaves behind a world that is worse than the world he found. A world scarred, damaged, tainted by the malice that Morgoth poured into its foundations. Sauron's instrumentalization of creation produces functional things, produces the ring, produces armies, produces the Nazgûl, produces a working empire with roads and fortresses and supply lines. The things that Sauron produces are evil in their purpose, but functional in their design. The things that Sauron produces work. They work because Sauron, unlike Morgoth, understands how things work, understands mechanics, understands systems, understands the relationship between design and function that makes a tool effective. Part 20. Beauty. Morgoth destroys beauty. Sauron deploys beauty. The distinction is simple, and the distinction is everything. When Morgoth encounters beauty, when Morgoth sees a beautiful thing, a beautiful being, a beautiful creation, Morgoth's immediate impulse is to ruin it. Morgoth captures the Silmarils and sets them in his crown, not because Morgoth appreciates the beauty of the Silmarils, but because Morgoth wants to possess it, to hoard it, to prevent anyone else from enjoying it. Morgoth twists the elves into orcs, not because Morgoth needs soldiers, but because the elves are beautiful, and their beauty offends Morgoth, and the twisting of beauty into ugliness is Morgoth's substitute for the creative act that he cannot perform. Morgoth's relationship to beauty is the relationship of the vandal to the painting, the relationship of the being who cannot create to the thing that was created, the relationship that produces destruction not from necessity, but from envy. Sauron's relationship to beauty is entirely different. Sauron does not destroy beauty. Sauron uses beauty. Sauron adopts a fair form, becomes Anatar, the beautiful counselor, the golden-haired gift-giver, who walks among the elves of Eregion offering wisdom and assistance. Sauron wears beauty the way a fisherman wears a lure, as a tool, as an instrument, as a means of attracting the prey. Sauron's beauty is not genuine. Sauron's beauty is performance, is the costume that the con artist wears to gain access to the Mark's house. The difference reveals their different relationships to the world. Morgoth wants to punish beauty. Sauron wants to exploit beauty. Morgoth sees beauty as an insult, as a reminder of the creative power that he does not possess, as the visible evidence of his failure, as the accusation that the world levels against the being who cannot contribute to it. Sauron sees beauty as a resource, as something that can be deployed, that can be weaponized, that can be used to achieve objectives that brute force alone cannot accomplish. Morgoth is the destroyer of the two trees. Sauron would never have destroyed the two trees. Sauron would have found a way to use the two trees, would have devised a scheme that converted the light of the trees into an instrument of power, that harnessed their beauty for his own purposes, that exploited the reverence that others felt for the trees as a mechanism of control. Sauron does not destroy things he can use. Sauron is too efficient for that. Sauron is too strategic for that. Sauron is too fundamentally unlike Morgoth for that. Part 21. Their relationship to the elves. Morgoth's relationship to the elves is hatred. Simple, total, unqualified hatred. Morgoth hates the elves because the elves are Ilúvatar's children, because the elves represent everything that Morgoth is not, because the elves can create and Morgoth cannot, because the elves are loved by the Valar and Morgoth is not, because the elves are beautiful and Morgoth's beauty has been destroyed by his own choices. Morgoth's hatred of the elves is the hatred of the failed for the successful, the hatred of the barren for the fertile, the hatred of the ugly for the beautiful. Morgoth kidnaps elves. Morgoth tortures elves. Morgoth corrupts elves, twists them, breaks them, remakes them into orcs, the parodies of elvendom that serve Morgoth's armies. Morgoth's treatment of the elves is genocide, is the systematic destruction of a people, the deliberate annihilation of their beauty, the forced conversion of their nature into something that serves Morgoth's hatred rather than Ilúvatar's love. Sauron's relationship to the elves is manipulation. Sauron does not hate the elves, not with Morgoth's primal, existential, all-consuming hatred. Sauron regards the elves as a problem to be managed, as a powerful faction that must be neutralized, co-opted, or controlled. Sauron approaches the elves the way a strategist approaches an obstacle, not with hatred, but with calculation. Sauron goes to the elves of Eregion as Anatar. Sauron offers the elves knowledge, offers them techniques that will enhance their craft, skills that will improve their work, powers that will extend their already formidable abilities. Sauron does not conquer the elves. Sauron collaborates with the elves. Sauron works alongside Celebrimbor and the Gwathi Madain, the elven smiths of Eregion, the craftsmen who forge the rings of power under Sauron's guidance. The collaboration is genuine in one sense. The elven smiths do learn from Sauron, do acquire new skills, do produce works of extraordinary power and beauty. The collaboration is fraudulent in a deeper sense. The elven smiths are being used, are contributing their talents to a project whose ultimate purpose they do not understand, are forging the instruments of their own enslavement while believing that they are advancing their own craft. Morgoth could never have walked among the elves as a teacher. Morgoth could never have sat in an elven workshop and offered guidance. Morgoth's relationship to the elves is too contaminated by hatred, too deformed by envy, too compromised by the primal loathing that the sight of elven creation provokes. Morgoth would rather destroy every elf in Middle-earth than spend an afternoon pretending to help one. Sauron can pretend. Sauron can smile. Sauron can offer his hand and wait patiently while the hand is taken and the trust is established and the trap is set. Sauron's patience is his deadliest weapon, the ability to delay gratification, to endure the tedium of collaboration, to invest years in a deception whose payoff may be decades away. Morgoth has no such patience. Morgoth has only rage. Part 22. Their names. Morgoth has two names. Melkor, he who arises in might, the name that Ilúvatar gave him, the name that reflects his original nature, the name of the mightiest I knew. And Morgoth, the dark enemy, the name that Fëanor gives him after the theft of the Silmarils and the murder of Finnu, the name of condemnation, the name that replaces the original and that defines the fallen god for the rest of the mythology. Morgoth wears his name like armor. Morgoth does not hide behind false identities. Morgoth does not adopt personas. Morgoth, is the dark enemy, is the being whose evil is visible and whose malice is undisguised. Morgoth's name is a declaration, is the announcement of what he is the warning that he carries with him into every encounter. Sauron has many names. This fact alone tells you something crucial about the difference between them. Sauron collects identities the way a spy collects passports, changes his name, changes his appearance, changes his story depending on the audience and the objective. Mairon, the Admirable. His original name, the name of the talented, orderly, dedicated servant of all. Sauron, the Abhorred, the name the elves give him after his fall, the name of revulsion. Annatar, Lord of Gifts, the disguise he wears in Eregion, the false identity of the benefactor. Gorthor, the Cruel, another elvish name, the name of fear. The Necromancer, the identity he assumes in Dol Guldur during the Third Age, the anonymous dark presence that Gandalf eventually identifies. The Lord of the Rings, the title that defines his relationship to his greatest creation. Morgoth's single identity is the identity of a being who does not negotiate with the world, who does not adapt to circumstances, who does not modify his presentation depending on his audience. Morgoth is what he is. The world can accept Morgoth, or the world can resist Morgoth. But the world will not see a different Morgoth either way. Sauron's multiple identities are the identities of a being who constantly adapts, who reads the room, who assesses the audience, who presents the version of himself that is most likely to achieve the desired result. Sauron is a different being to the elves of Eregion than he is to the men of Menor, and he is a different being to the men of Menor than he is to the orcs of Mordor. The core is the same. The desire for order, the will to dominate, the relentless pursuit of control, but the presentation changes, and the changing of the presentation is itself a form of power. Part 23. What they built. Morgoth builds Angband. Sauron builds Mordor. The comparison is instructive. Angband is a fortress. Mordor is a kingdom. Angband is a place where Morgoth hides. Mordor is a place where Sauron rules. Angband is underground, is a vast complex of tunnels and pits and chambers, a negative space carved into the roots of the mountains. Angband is designed for concealment and defense, is a hole to hide in, a burrow to fight from, a position from which to strike and to which to retreat. Angband has no agriculture. Angband has no economy. Angband has no civilian population. Angband is a military installation, a fortress and nothing more, a place of war with no peacetime function. Mordor is a country. Mordor has borders, the mountain ranges of the Ered Lithui and the Ethel Darth that surround the land of Mordor on three sides. Mordor has infrastructure, roads, watchtowers, supply lines, the aqueducts and channels that provide water to the plateau of Gorgoroth. Mordor has a slave economy, has agricultural production in the region of Nirn, the southern part of Mordor where slaves grow the food that feeds Sauron's armies. Mordor has administration, has the chain of command that runs from Sauron through the Nazgul through the orc captains and beyond. the hierarchy of authority that allows a single intelligence to govern a territory the size of a substantial nation. Mordor is ugly. Mordor is oppressive. Mordor is a place of suffering and slavery. But Mordor functions. Mordor is a working state, a functional entity with defined borders and administrative structures and economic outputs. Mordor is the product of a mind that understands governance, that understands logistics, that understands supply chains, that understands the practical requirements of maintaining a military force across distances and over decades. Angband is not a state. Angband is a lair. Angband is the hole that the dragon crawls into, the den of the predator, the fortress of the warrior, the place from which violence emanates and to which violence returns. Angband has no administrative structure beyond Morgoth's personal will. Angband has no economy beyond plunder. Angband has no governance beyond terror. The difference between Angband and Mordor is the difference between Morgoth and Sauron in architectural form. The lair and the kingdom. The fortress and the state. The hiding place of the destroyer and the headquarters of the administrator. Part 24. How they fell originally. The manner of their original falls, the choices that transform them from servants of the good into masters of evil, reveals the fundamental difference in their characters. Morgoth falls from pride. Morgoth falls because Morgoth believes that he should be greater than he is, that the mightiest of the Ainur should be the creator rather than the created, that the most powerful being should be the supreme being, that might makes right, and that Morgoth's might is right. Morgoth's fall is the Luciferian fall, the fall of the angel who refuses to accept his place in the hierarchy, who rebels against the authority above him, who declares war on the Creator because the Creator will not share the one power that the angel does not possess. Morgoth's fall is dramatic. Morgoth's fall is cosmic. Morgoth's fall is the kind of fall that produces mythology, that generates stories, that inspires the great narratives of rebellion and defeat that echo through human literature. Sauron's fall is quieter. Sauron's fall is more insidious. Sauron does not fall from pride, or rather Sauron's pride is of a different kind. Sauron does not believe that he should be Ilvatar. Sauron believes that the world should be better organized. Sauron falls from efficiency. Sauron falls because Sauron looks at the world that the Valar are shaping and sees disorder, sees waste, sees inefficiency, sees the maddening spectacle of powerful beings who could arrange the world perfectly, but who instead allow things to develop organically, to grow unpredictably, to evolve in directions that no one controls and no one can predict. The Valar value freedom. The Valar allow the world to unfold. The Valar do not impose a single design on reality, do not force every element of the world into a predetermined pattern, do not eliminate the randomness and the spontaneity that make the world alive. The Valar trust the process. The Valar trust the music. Sauron does not trust the process. Sauron does not trust the music. Sauron sees the results of freedom and finds them intolerable, finds them wasteful, finds them chaotic, finds them offensive to the orderly mind that Ol's workshops cultivated. Sauron looks at freedom and sees a problem. Sauron looks at disorder and sees a disease. Sauron looks at the world as it is and decides that the world as it should be requires a single directing intelligence, requires a planner, a manager, a being who will impose the order that freedom refuses to produce. Morgoth falls to Morgoth. Sauron falls to Morgoth, falls because Morgoth offers what the Valar do not, the promise of a world arranged according to a single will, the promise of efficiency, the promise of order. Sauron serves Morgoth not because Sauron shares Morgoth's hatred of creation, but because Morgoth's power offers Sauron the means to impose the order that Sauron desires. Sauron is Morgoth's servant, but Sauron is never Morgoth's follower. The distinction is crucial. Sauron does not follow Morgoth's vision. Sauron uses Morgoth's power to pursue Sauron's vision. Part 25. The Master and the Servant. The relationship between Morgoth and Sauron is not the relationship of equals. The relationship is not even the relationship of like minds. The relationship is the relationship of convenience, of mutual exploitation, of two beings who use each other for different purposes and who would discard each other if a better option presented itself. Morgoth uses Sauron as a lieutenant, as a capable administrator, a talented organizer, a being who can manage the practical details of running a war while Morgoth focuses on the grand, the cosmic, the operatic business of being a dark god. Morgoth values Sauron's efficiency. Morgoth values Sauron's competence. Morgoth does not value Sauron's company. Sauron uses Morgoth as a vehicle, as a source of power, a framework within which to operate, a dark authority whose shadow provides cover for Sauron's own ambitions. Sauron learns from Morgoth. Sauron studies Morgoth's methods. Sauron observes Morgoth's mistakes. And Sauron's later career is in many ways a systematic correction of Morgoth's errors. Morgoth wastes power. Sauron notes this and resolves to invest power wisely. Morgoth fights personally and gets wounded. Sauron notes this and resolves to fight through proxies. Morgoth cannot disguise himself. Sauron notes this and cultivates the art of deception. Morgoth alienates potential allies through terror and cruelty. Sauron notes this and develops the strategy of seduction and co-optation. Sauron is not Morgoth's heir. Sauron is Morgoth's revision. Sauron takes Morgoth's raw evil and refines it, strips away the waste, eliminates the inefficiency, removes the emotional excess that makes Morgoth's evil spectacular, but ultimately self-defeating. Sauron produces a leaner, meaner, more sustainable form of evil, an evil that can survive for ages, that can endure setbacks, that can rebuild after defeat, that can operate without the constant expenditure of divine energy that Morgoth's approach requires. Part 26. Patience. Morgoth is impatient. Sauron is patient. The distinction sounds simple. The distinction determines everything. Morgoth's impatience drives every catastrophic decision in his career. Morgoth disrupts the music because Morgoth cannot wait for the music to unfold. Morgoth steals the Silmarils because Morgoth cannot endure the sight of beauty in someone else's hands. Morgoth kills Finwë because Morgoth cannot tolerate an obstacle between himself and his desire. Morgoth fights Fingolfin because Morgoth's pride cannot accept the shame of refusing a challenge. Every pivotal moment in Morgoth's story is a moment of impatience, a moment when Morgoth's inability to delay, to plan, to wait, produces a choice that weakens his position and strengthens his enemies. Sauron's patience is his greatest weapon. Sauron waits in All's service for ages before falling. Sauron serves Morgoth for centuries, learning, observing, cataloguing errors. Sauron spends years in Eregion as Anatar, building trust, cultivating relationships, establishing the foundations of the deception before revealing the trap. Sauron spends decades as a prisoner in Menor, slowly, methodically, patiently corrupting a civilization from the inside. Sauron waits 1,000 years after the fall of Menor to rebuild his power in Mordor. Sauron waits centuries in Dol Guldur, gathering strength, building alliances, preparing for the final war. Sauron's patience is not passivity. Sauron's patience is strategic, is the disciplined refusal to act before the optimal moment, the calculated decision to invest time now for advantage later. The understanding that the most effective blow is the blow that lands when the enemy is unprepared. Sauron's patience is the patience of the chess player who sacrifices a piece to gain a position. The patience of the mind that can hold a plan for centuries without losing focus or urgency. Morgoth has no such patience. Morgoth cannot hold a plan for centuries, because Morgoth's nature does not permit long-term thinking. Morgoth's nature is immediate, is the desire of the moment, the rage of the moment, the jealousy of the moment. Morgoth's evil is reactive, is the response to the stimulus, the reaction to the provocation, the lashing out of a being who cannot control his impulses long enough to formulate a strategy. Part 27. What happens when they lose? Both Dark Lords suffer defeats. Both are set back, weakened, temporarily reduced. The difference is what they do afterward. When Morgoth loses, Morgoth rages. Morgoth's response to defeat is fury, is the intensification of everything that makes Morgoth Morgoth, the amplification of the rage and the hatred and the destructive impulse. When Morgoth is defeated by the Valar and imprisoned for 3 ages, Morgoth emerges from imprisonment unchanged, is still the same being, with the same desires, the same methods, the same fundamental approach to the world. Morgoth does not learn from defeat. Morgoth does not adapt. Morgoth does not modify his approach based on the evidence of its failure. When Sauron loses, Sauron adapts. Sauron's response to defeat is strategic, is the assessment of what went wrong, the identification of the error, the modification of the approach to avoid the same failure in the future. When Sauron loses his body in the fall of Menor, Sauron does not despair. Sauron flies back to Mordor, reconstitutes himself, and begins again. Begins with the lessons of Menor incorporated into his planning, begins with the knowledge that fair forms are no longer available, begins with the adjustment to his strategy that the loss requires. When Sauron loses the ring at the end of the Second Age, when Isildur cuts the ring from his hand and Sauron's body is destroyed, Sauron does not give up. Sauron retreats. Sauron hides. Sauron spends 1,000 years as a shadow, a diminished presence, a nameless dread, a formless spirit that gradually gathers strength in the dark places of the world. Sauron goes to Dol Guldur. Sauron becomes the necromancer. Sauron rebuilds, slowly, patiently, methodically, with the discipline and the focus that are the hallmarks of his character. Morgoth never rebuilds. Morgoth never adapts. Morgoth never learns. Morgoth's approach to the world is fixed, is set in stone, is carved into the foundations of his being by the original discordance in the music. Morgoth is the same being at the end of the First Age that he was at the beginning of the world, the same rage, the same hatred, the same fundamental inability to create or to compromise or to accept any authority other than his own. The difference between the being who adapts and the being who does not is the difference between the villain who can be permanently defeated and the villain who keeps coming back. Morgoth is defeated once. Sauron is defeated 3 times, loses Eregion, loses Menor, loses the last alliance. And each time, Sauron returns. Part 28. What they corrupted. Morgoth corrupts matter. Sauron corrupts will. The distinction is precise, and the distinction is total. Morgoth's corruption operates on the physical, on the substance of the world, on the bodies of living beings, on the material reality that the Valar shaped from the vision of the music. Morgoth's corruption transforms elves into orcs, transforms beasts into monsters, transforms the landscape into a wasteland. Morgoth's corruption is visible, is written on the bodies of his victims, is carved into the terrain of Beleriand, is evident in the twisted forms and ruined landscapes that Morgoth's presence produces. Sauron's corruption operates on the spiritual, on the will, on the mind, on the inner landscape of the beings that Sauron seeks to control. Sauron does not transform bodies. Sauron transforms loyalties. Sauron does not twist flesh. Sauron twists intentions. Sauron's corruption is invisible, is hidden inside the minds of the corrupted, is undetectable from the outside until the corruption has progressed too far to reverse. The rings of power are the instruments of Sauron's corruption, the devices that attach to the will of the bearer and gradually, imperceptibly, irresistibly redirect that will towards Sauron's purposes. The ring-bearer does not know that they are being corrupted. The ring-bearer feels more powerful, more capable, more in control. The ring-bearer experiences the corruption as empowerment, experiences the loss of freedom as the gain of strength, experiences the surrender of will as the acquisition of power. Morgoth's corruption is horrifying because it is visible, because you can see what Morgoth has done, because the orc's twisted face tells you everything you need to know about the process that produced it. Sauron's corruption is terrifying because it is invisible, because you cannot see it happening, because the Nazgul looked like kings and warriors until the moment when the last shred of their humanity fell away and the Wraith was revealed. The horror of visibility versus the terror of invisibility. The monster you can see versus the monster you can't. Morgoth and Sauron, even in the way they destroy, are completely different kinds of evil. Part 29. Dragons and Wraiths. Morgoth's greatest servants are dragons. Sauron's greatest servants are wraiths. The difference is not cosmetic. Dragons are creatures of destruction. Dragons burn. Dragons crush. Dragons lay waste to cities and armies and landscapes with the physical, material, overwhelming force that characterizes Morgoth's approach to the world. Glorong, the father of dragons, is a weapon, a living siege engine, a mobile catastrophe, a creature whose primary function is to destroy things. Glorong burns the plains of Ardgalen. Glorong levels Nargothrond. Glorong's breath is fire and ruin and the annihilation of everything that lies before him. And Caligan the Black, the mightiest of all dragons, is so vast that his fall breaks the towers of Thangorodrim. Dragons are spectacle. Dragons are force. Dragons are the physical manifestation of Morgoth's desire to break the world. But dragons are also individuals. Dragons have personalities. Dragons have desires of their own. Desires for gold, for dominion, for the satisfaction of their own appetites. Glorong manipulates Trin and Ninor through psychological cruelty that suggests an intelligence beyond mere weaponry. Smaug hoards treasure and trades riddles with Bilbo. Dragons are not merely tools. Dragons are beings, are creatures with independent wills that Morgoth has corrupted and directed, but that retain their own agency and their own characters. This independence is significant. Morgoth's servants retain their individuality because Morgoth's corruption operates on the physical, transforms the body, but does not wholly replace the mind. Dragons are Morgoth's creation, but dragons are also their own creatures. The relationship between Morgoth and his servants is the relationship of the master to the powerful but unreliable subordinate. The relationship in which control is maintained through fear rather than through the systematic elimination of independent will. The Nazgul are creatures of control. The Nazgul do not burn cities. The Nazgul do not crush armies. The Nazgul infiltrate. The Nazgul intimidate. The Nazgul command. The Nazgul are administrators of fear, beings whose primary function is not to destroy but to govern, to direct, to extend Sauron's will across the territories that Sauron seeks to control. The Witch King rules Angmar for centuries. The Nazgul command Sauron's armies. The Nazgul lead in the way that generals and governors lead, through authority, through chain of command, through the systematic application of power to the management of territory. The Nazgul have no individuality. The Nazgul have no independent wills. The Nazgul are extensions of Sauron, are projections of a single intelligence, are nodes in a network that converge on a single controlling mind. The Nazgul do not have opinions. The Nazgul do not have desires that conflict with Sauron's desires. The Nazgul are the perfect servants, the servants whose wills have been so completely subsumed by the Master's will that independent action is impossible. Dragons are Morgoth's style, raw, physical, spectacular, and ultimately temporary. Dragons die. Dragons can be killed, Glorung by Trin, Smaug by Bard, and Calagon by Erendil. Dragons are powerful but vulnerable, are physical beings that can be physically destroyed, physical forces that can be physically opposed. The Nazgul are Sauron's style, subtle, spiritual, systematic, and nearly permanent. The Nazgul do not die easily. The Nazgul cannot be killed by ordinary weapons. The Nazgul exist in a twilight between life and death, bound to the rings, bound to Sauron, bound to an existence that is not truly alive and not truly dead, and that persists as long as the power that sustains them persists. Morgoth's greatest weapons break things. Sauron's greatest weapons control things. The difference is the difference between the villain who wants to destroy the city and the villain who wants to own the city, the difference between the force of nature and the force of governance. Part 30. How they used men. Morgoth fears men. Sauron exploits men. The difference tells you everything about the gap between them. Morgoth fears the race of men because Morgoth fears what he does not understand. Men are Ilúvatar's second gift, the second-born, the beings who come into the world after the elves, the beings who carry within them the gift of men, which is mortality. Mortality is the gift that Ilúvatar gives to men and does not give to elves. The gift of a finite life, a limited time in the world. A death that is not a punishment but a release, a passage beyond the circles of the world to a destination that even the Valar do not know. Morgoth does not understand mortality. Morgoth does not understand the gift. Morgoth fears what lies beyond death, fears the unknown destination, fears the power of Ilúvatar that operates in the realm beyond Arda, fears the possibility that men, in death, pass beyond his reach and enter a place where his corruption has no hold. Morgoth's response to men is to corrupt their understanding of death, to teach men to fear death, to dread it, to regard it not as a gift but as a curse, to see mortality as a punishment rather than a release. This corruption of men's understanding of death is one of Morgoth's most devastating achievements, and one of his most characteristic. Morgoth cannot control death. Morgoth cannot prevent men from dying. Morgoth cannot follow men beyond the circles of the world. So Morgoth does the next best thing. Morgoth poisons their relationship with mortality. Morgoth teaches men to see their defining gift as a defining curse, teaches them to spend their limited lives in fear of the limitation itself, teaches them to waste the gift by hating it. Sauron does not fear men. Sauron studies men. Sauron analyses men. Sauron identifies the pressure points, the desires, the fears, the ambitions, the vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Sauron understands that men want power, want longevity, want influence, want the ability to extend their brief lives beyond the limits that mortality imposes. Sauron offers men the rings, offers them the extension of life, the enhancement of power, the fulfillment of the desires that mortality makes urgent. Sauron does not fear men. Sauron provides men with the rope that they use to hang themselves. The difference in approach reveals the difference in intelligence. Morgoth's approach to men is fear-based. is the approach of the being who encounters the unknown and reacts with hostility. Sauron's approach to men is analysis-based, is the approach of the being who encounters the unknown and reacts with curiosity, who studies the new variable, who identifies the exploitable features, who converts the unknown into the useful. Morgoth's approach to men is crude, is the approach of the predator to the prey, the approach of the being who recognizes danger and responds with violence. Sauron's approach to men is sophisticated, is the approach of the salesman to the customer, the approach of the being who recognizes desire and responds with product. The Easterlings who serve Morgoth in the First Age serve out of fear and coercion. The men who serve Sauron in the Second and Third Ages serve out of a complex mixture of fear, ambition, cultural manipulation, and genuine belief that Sauron offers a better alternative. Morgoth's men are conscripts. Sauron's men include volunteers, include kings and warriors who choose to serve, because Sauron has convinced them that service is in their interest. The difference between the conscript and the volunteer is the difference between Morgoth and Sauron in miniature. The being who compels and the being who persuades. The being who takes by force and the being who takes by contract. Part 31. The Third Age. Sauron's behavior in the Third Age, the age of the Lord of the Rings, the age that most fans know best, demonstrates everything that separates him from Morgoth. Sauron returns to Middle-earth as a shadow. Not as a conqueror, not as a dark god striding across the landscape, not as a being of terrible power announcing his presence with thunder and fire. Sauron returns as a whisper, as a nameless dread, as the necromancer of Dol Guldur, as a presence felt but not seen, feared but not identified. Sauron hides in Dol Guldur for centuries. Centuries, Sauron sits in the ruins of an old fortress in the southern part of Mirkwood and waits for his power to grow, waits for his strength to return, waits for the moment when he can re-enter the stage without inviting the immediate response of the wise. Sauron's patience during this period is extraordinary, is the patience of a being who has already lived for thousands of years and who is willing to wait for thousands more if the strategy demands it. Morgoth could never have done this. Morgoth could never have sat in a ruin for centuries, anonymous, unrecognized, gathering strength in silence. Morgoth's nature demands recognition. Morgoth's pride demands acknowledgement. Morgoth's character cannot tolerate anonymity, cannot accept the condition of being unknown, of being unnamed, of being a shadow in a forest rather than a god on a throne. Sauron's anonymity is strategic. Sauron is the necromancer because the necromancer is less threatening than Sauron. The White Council, Gandalf, Saruman, Galadriel, Elrond takes centuries to identify the necromancer as Sauron precisely because the identification seems improbable. Sauron, the great enemy, the Lord of the Rings, the being who nearly conquered the world, Sauron hiding in a forest? Sauron pretending to be a minor dark spirit? The disguise works because the disguise is beneath Sauron's dignity, and the wise assume that a being of Sauron's stature would not stoop to such a humble concealment. Part 32. The Eye. In the Third Age, Sauron's physical form is reduced, is diminished, is not the fair form of Anatar or the dark warrior of the Last Alliance, but something lesser, something limited. Tolkien tells us that Sauron has rebuilt a body. Gollum, who endured torment in Barad-dûr, describes a hand with only 4 fingers, the hand from which Isildur cut the ring. But Sauron's body is no longer his primary instrument. Sauron's primary instrument is the eye. Sauron projects himself as the eye. The lidless eye, the great eye, wreathed in flame, that watches from the top of Barad-dûr, that sees across the distances of Middle-earth, that searches for the ring. The eye is Sauron's will made visible, the manifestation of his attention, the projection of his searching intelligence across the distances that his diminished body cannot cross. The eye is surveillance. The eye is control through watching, is the maintenance of power through the constant, unblinking, all-penetrating observation of the territory that Sauron claims. The eye is the modern panopticon, is the watcher who watches everything, whose watching itself is a form of power, whose observation produces obedience without the need for physical enforcement. Morgoth does not watch. Morgoth does not surveil. Morgoth does not maintain control through the subtle, systematic observation of his territory. Morgoth sits on his throne and waits for things to come to him, waits for his servants to report, waits for his enemies to attack, waits in the reactive passivity of a being who cannot project his will across distances without projecting his person. The eye is Sauron's genius adapted to Sauron's limitations. Sauron cannot be everywhere. The eye allows Sauron to see everywhere. Sauron cannot project physical force across the distances of Middle-earth. The eye allows Sauron to project psychological force, to create the impression of omniscience, to generate the fear that comes from being watched, to produce obedience through the knowledge that nothing escapes the gaze of the Master. Part 33. The War of the Ring. Sauron's conduct of the War of the Ring is the final demonstration of everything that separates him from Morgoth. Sauron does not fight the War of the Ring. Sauron manages the War of the Ring. Sauron orchestrates the War of the Ring, deploys armies, coordinates attacks, manipulates allies, exploits divisions, manages supply lines, maintains communications through the Palantry. Sauron is the commander-in-chief, the intelligence at the top of the hierarchy, the mind that processes information and issues orders and adjusts strategy based on the developing situation. Sauron's war is a war of logistics and intelligence. Sauron sends armies from multiple directions, sends the forces of Mordor against Gondor, sends the forces of Dol Guldur against Lothlorien and the Woodland Realm, sends the forces of the Easterlings against Dale and Erebor. Sauron coordinates these attacks, times them to coincide, plans them to overwhelm the defender's ability to respond on multiple fronts, designs the campaign as a strategic operation rather than a single battle. Morgoth's wars are not like this. Morgoth's wars are battles, are confrontations, are clashes of arms in which the outcome is determined by force rather than by strategy. Morgoth sends his armies forward and hopes that they win. Morgoth's strategic thinking is limited, is reactive rather than proactive, is the response to events rather than the anticipation of events. Morgoth does not coordinate multi-front campaigns. Morgoth does not manage supply lines. Morgoth does not use intelligence networks to assess enemy strength and disposition. Sauron's war is modern in a way that Morgoth's wars are not. Sauron's war involves espionage, involves spies, involves the collection and analysis of information, involves the use of deception and disinformation to confuse and mislead the enemy. Sauron uses the Palantry to manipulate Saruman and Denethor, uses the Seeing Stones as instruments of psychological warfare, as tools that allow Sauron to show his enemies carefully selected visions that drive them toward despair or toward the decisions that Sauron wants them to make. The contrast with Morgoth is total. Morgoth fights wars the way a thunderstorm fights, with raw power, with overwhelming force, with the expectation that might will simply prevail. Sauron fights wars the way an intelligence agency fights, with information, with manipulation, with the patient, systematic exploitation of every weakness and every division in the enemy's coalition. Part 34. What they fear losing. Morgoth fears losing status. Sauron fears losing control. The distinction is the distinction between pride and purpose, between the being whose identity is built on his position in the hierarchy and the being whose identity is built on his ability to direct events. Morgoth's greatest fear is the loss of his rank, is the loss of his claim to be the mightiest, the most powerful, the supreme being. Morgoth fears the Silmarils not because the Silmarils threaten his power, but because the Silmarils remind him of his creative failure. Remind him that an elf can produce beauty that Morgoth cannot, that a created being can achieve something that the mightiest Valar cannot achieve. Morgoth's fear is the fear of irrelevance, the fear that the world does not need him, that creation can proceed without him, that the music can be beautiful without his contribution. Sauron's greatest fear is the loss of his system, is the loss of the ring, the loss of the network, the loss of the mechanism of control that Sauron has built over centuries and that represents Sauron's life's work. Sauron does not fear irrelevance. Sauron fears disorder, fears the collapse of the structure, the breakdown of the system, the return of the chaos that Sauron has spent his existence trying to eliminate. The difference in fear produces a difference in vulnerability. Morgoth is vulnerable to challenges to his status, to acts of defiance, to demonstrations of beauty, to anything that reminds him that he is not the supreme being he believes he should be. Fingolfin's challenge hurts Morgoth, not because Fingolfin can actually defeat Morgoth, but because Fingolfin's courage challenges Morgoth's claim to supremacy. Sauron is vulnerable to threats to his system, to the ring, to the network of rings, to the structure of control that Sauron has built. Sauron's fear of the ring's destruction is not vanity. Sauron's fear is practical, is the recognition that the ring is the foundation of everything that Sauron has built, and that the destruction of the ring means the destruction of the system. Part 35. Sauron after Morgoth. The most telling period in Sauron's career is the period after Morgoth's defeat, the period when Sauron operates independently, without a master, without the framework of Morgoth's service. Sauron does not mourn Morgoth. This is remarkable. Sauron, who served Morgoth for thousands of years, who was Morgoth's chief lieutenant, who learned from Morgoth and studied under Morgoth and carried out Morgoth's orders throughout the wars of the First Age. Sauron does not mourn his master's defeat. Sauron does not try to rescue Morgoth from the void. Sauron does not establish a cult of Morgoth's memory or build a movement dedicated to Morgoth's return. Sauron moves on. Sauron takes what he learned from Morgoth and applies it better, applies it more efficiently, applies it with the corrections and improvements that Sauron's analysis of Morgoth's failures has produced. Sauron looks at Morgoth's career the way a business analyst looks at a failed company, studies the mistakes, identifies the structural weaknesses, redesigns the model. When the Valar offer Sauron the chance to repent after Morgoth's defeat, when Enwë, the herald of Manwë, tells Sauron that he may return to Valinor and submit to the judgment of the Valar, Sauron considers the offer. Sauron is genuinely tempted. Sauron is not so hardened, not so committed to evil, not so lost that the possibility of return is meaningless to him. Sauron considers repentance. Sauron refuses, not because Sauron loves evil, not because Sauron is committed to destruction. Sauron refuses because Sauron is ashamed, is unwilling to accept the humiliation of judgment, is unwilling to submit to a process that would require him to acknowledge his crimes and to accept the authority of beings he has spent millennia opposing. Sauron's pride is not Morgoth's cosmic pride. Sauron's pride is personal, is the pride of the professional who cannot bear to admit that his life's work was wrong. Morgoth would never have been tempted by the offer of repentance. Morgoth would never have considered returning to the Valar. Morgoth's pride is absolute, is the pride of a being who has declared himself the equal of the Creator, and who cannot reverse that declaration without ceasing to be himself. Sauron's pride is contingent, is the pride of a being who has built a career on a particular approach to the world, and who cannot abandon that approach without abandoning his identity. The difference between absolute pride and contingent pride is the difference between a fall that is permanent and a fall that might have been reversed. Morgoth cannot come back. Sauron almost does. Part 36. The Ring and the Crown. The objects that define them are as different as the beings who wear them. Morgoth wears the Iron Crown. The crown is made of iron, the base metal, the common substance, the material that is as far from the beauty of gold or mithril as metal can be. The crown is crude, is heavy, is brutal, is the product of a mind that values power over aesthetics. Morgoth sets the Silmarils in the crown, forces the three most beautiful objects ever created into a frame of black iron, forces the light of the two trees into a setting of darkness. The crown is a violation, is the imprisonment of beauty and ugliness, the subjugation of light to darkness, the forcible combination of the sacred and the profane. The crown burns Morgoth's head. The Silmarils, hallowed by Arda, burn the hands and the brow that hold them. Morgoth wears the crown despite the pain, wears it because possession matters more than comfort, because the hoarding of beauty is more important than the enjoyment of it, because Morgoth's relationship to the Silmarils is not the relationship of the lover to the beloved, but the relationship of the miser to the gold. Sauron wears the One Ring. The ring is made of gold, the noble metal, the material of beauty and value, the substance that human cultures have associated with power and divinity since the beginning of civilization. The ring is elegant, is simple, is unadorned, is the product of a mind that values efficiency over spectacle. The ring is a tool, is designed, is engineered, is the product of genuine craft applied to a specific purpose. The ring does not burn Sauron. The ring serves Sauron. The ring extends Sauron's will, amplifies Sauron's power, projects Sauron's control across the distances of Middle-earth. Sauron's relationship to the ring is the relationship of the craftsman to his masterwork, is the relationship of the designer to the instrument, the engineer to the machine, the builder to the building. The crown is a trophy. The ring is a tool. Morgoth wears his power because Morgoth wants to be seen. Sauron uses his power because Sauron wants to be effective. The difference between being seen and being effective is the difference between Morgoth and Sauron. Part 37. How they were defeated. The manner of their defeats tells you everything about the difference between them. Morgoth is defeated by force. The Valar come for Morgoth at the end of the First Age, send the host of the West, the armies of the Blessed Realm, the overwhelming military power of the divine. The host of the West breaks Angband. The host of the West smashes Morgoth's gates, destroys Morgoth's armies, burns Morgoth's fortresses. The war is cataclysmic, is fought with the power of the Valar, with the wings of eagles, with the fire of divine warriors who shake the foundations of the world. Beleriand sinks beneath the sea. The geography of the world is rewritten. The price of defeating Morgoth is the destruction of the continent on which Morgoth made his stand. Morgoth is dragged from his throne in chains, is physically seized, physically restrained, physically removed from the world by beings who are stronger than him. Morgoth's defeat is a defeat of strength by greater strength, a confrontation of force in which the more powerful party prevails. Morgoth is beaten because something bigger came along. The lesson is simple. If you fight the world with force, the world will eventually produce a greater force. Sauron is defeated by a hobbit. Sauron, the strategic genius, the master manipulator, the being who corrupted Numenor and forged the rings of power and built an empire that spans a continent. Sauron is defeated by a small creature from the Shire who carries the ring to Mount Doom and destroys it. The defeat is not a defeat of force. Frodo does not overpower Sauron. Frodo does not outfight Sauron. Frodo does not bring an army that is mightier than Sauron's army. Frodo brings himself, brings his will, his endurance, his willingness to carry a burden that no one else can carry, his acceptance of a mission that will almost certainly kill him. The defeat is a defeat of comprehension. Sauron is not overpowered. Sauron is outsmarted. Or rather, Sauron is out-imagined. Sauron cannot conceive of a being who would carry the ring to Mount Doom and throw it in. Sauron cannot imagine a being who possesses the ring and does not use it, who carries the instrument of ultimate power across a continent and voluntarily destroys it. Sauron's mind, brilliant as it is, cannot encompass the concept of self-sacrifice, cannot process the idea of a being who gives up power rather than seizing it, who chooses weakness over strength, who walks into the fire rather than bending the world to his will. This is Sauron's blind spot. This is the one variable that Sauron's system cannot account for. Sauron understands desire. Sauron understands ambition. Sauron understands the will to power. Sauron does not understand the will to surrender, the choice to let go, the decision to destroy rather than to wield, the acceptance of loss rather than the pursuit of gain. Morgoth's defeat requires an army. Sauron's defeat requires an act of imagination. Morgoth is beaten by power. Sauron is beaten by humility. The god falls to force. The administrator falls to the one variable that his system cannot account for, the being who does not want power. This is Tolkien's deepest statement about the two kinds of evil. Nihilistic evil, the evil that wants to destroy the world, can only be defeated by overwhelming force. You cannot reason with nihilism. You cannot outsmart destruction. You can only oppose it with strength. Totalitarian evil, the evil that wants to control the world, can be defeated by the refusal to be controlled. You do not need an army to defeat the tyrant. You need a being who will not submit, a being whose refusal to accept the system breaks the system. Part 38. The Void and the Nothing. Morgoth is cast into the void. Sauron dissipates into nothing. The difference is the difference between imprisonment and annihilation. The void is outside the world. The void is the emptiness beyond the circles of Arda, the formless darkness that exists beyond creation, the space where nothing has been made and nothing exists. Morgoth is cast into this emptiness, is thrust through the door of night, expelled from the world, removed from the creation that he spent his existence trying to destroy. Morgoth's punishment is exile. Morgoth is not destroyed. Morgoth is banished, is sent away, is removed from the world, is placed outside the reach of the beings he harmed. Morgoth still exists in the void. Morgoth's spirit persists, diminished, weakened, stripped of the divine power that he spent on corruption, but still present, still conscious, still the being who was once the mightiest of the Valar. The void is, in a sense, exactly where Morgoth began. Morgoth searched the void before the world was made, searched the emptiness for the imperishable flame, wandered the formless darkness, hoping to find the creative fire that would make him equal to Ilúvatar. The void is Morgoth's punishment and Morgoth's origin. The place where Morgoth's story begins and the place where Morgoth's story ends. The emptiness that Morgoth entered voluntarily as a seeker, and that Morgoth now inhabits involuntarily as a prisoner. Tolkien suggests that Morgoth will return. The last battle, the Dagor-Dagarath, the final conflict at the end of the world, is prophesied to include Morgoth's return from the void, a final confrontation between the forces of good and evil that will determine the ultimate fate of creation. Morgoth's story does not end. Morgoth's story is suspended, is paused, is held in abeyance, waiting for the final chapter that will bring everything to a conclusion. The possibility of return is itself a statement about the nature of Morgoth's evil. Morgoth's evil is permanent. Morgoth's evil is woven into the substance of the world. Morgoth's evil cannot be finished, because Morgoth's evil is not confined to Morgoth's person, is dispersed, is diffused, is embedded in the rock and the water and the fundamental structure of physical reality. Morgoth in the void is separated from his evil. Morgoth's evil remains in the world without him. The evil continues even when the person who introduced it is gone. Sauron's end is different. Sauron's end is nothing. When the ring is destroyed, when Gollum falls into the crack of doom and the ring melts in the fire that forged it, Sauron's power is unmade. Sauron's spirit rises from Barad docked like a vast shadow, a great dark shape that towers above Mordor, that reaches toward the sky, that strains against the wind, and then the wind takes it. The shadow is blown away, the shape is dispersed. Sauron is gone, not exiled, not imprisoned, not sent somewhere else. Gone, dissipated, reduced to an impotent spirit that Tolkien says will never again be able to take shape or to exercise will in the world. The image is extraordinary. The great dark shape rising from Barad Doctor, the shadow that has hung over Middle-earth for ages, the presence that has dominated the Third Age and shaped the history of every nation on the continent, this shadow rises one last time, reaches toward the west as if groping for the blessed realm that Sauron has been denied, and is caught by a wind from the west and blown away like smoke. The wind is the Valar's wind. The wind is the breath of the divine. The wind that blows Sauron away is the same wind that Manu commands, the wind of heaven, the wind of justice, the wind that carries the last remnant of Sauron into nothingness. Sauron is not punished. Sauron is nullified. Sauron is reduced to nothing, not to the nothing of the void, which is a place, but to the nothing of powerlessness, which is a condition. Sauron's spirit persists, but Sauron's power does not. Sauron exists, but Sauron cannot act. Sauron is conscious, but Sauron is impotent, is reduced to a consciousness without agency, a mind without means, an intelligence without instruments. The difference between exile and annihilation, between imprisonment and nullification, reflects the difference between the two Dark Lords. Morgoth is too big to destroy, is too deeply woven into the fabric of the world, is too fundamentally integrated into the structure of reality to be eliminated. You can remove Morgoth from the world, but you cannot remove the world from Morgoth. Cannot extract the corruption that Morgoth has poured into the substance of Arda without destroying Arda itself. Sauron is too concentrated to survive. Sauron put his power in one place, and the destruction of that place destroys everything. Sauron's efficiency is his undoing. Sauron's concentration, the very quality that makes Sauron a more effective Dark Lord than Morgoth, is the quality that makes Sauron's defeat permanent and total. Part 39. The Lesson of Gandalf. Gandalf's role in the story illuminates the difference between Morgoth and Sauron, because Gandalf is sent to Middle-earth specifically to oppose Sauron, and the manner of Gandalf's opposition tells us what kind of evil Sauron represents. Gandalf does not fight Sauron with force. Gandalf does not raise armies. Gandalf does not marshal the powers of the West against the power of the East. Gandalf opposes Sauron with wisdom, with counsel, with encouragement, with the patient cultivation of alliances and the careful nurturing of hope. Gandalf's mission is not military. Gandalf's mission is spiritual, is the opposition of wisdom to tyranny, of counsel to control, of free will to domination. This approach would not work against Morgoth. Wisdom cannot defeat nihilism. Counsel cannot overcome the will to destroy. Hope cannot resist the force that wants to annihilate hope itself. Morgoth requires the Valar's armies, requires the overwhelming physical force that only the divine can bring to bear against the divine. Gandalf cannot defeat Morgoth because Gandalf's tools are not designed for the kind of evil that Morgoth represents. Gandalf can oppose Sauron because Sauron's evil is the kind of evil that wisdom can resist. Sauron's evil is the evil of control, the evil that operates through systems, through manipulation, through the corruption of wills rather than the destruction of bodies. Wisdom resists control. Counsel resists manipulation. Free will resists domination. The tools that Gandalf carries, his knowledge, his insight, his ability to inspire and to encourage, are precisely the tools that are needed against an enemy who seeks to dominate rather than to destroy. The Valar understand this. The Valar send Gandalf as a Maya, not as a Valar. The Valar send Gandalf in the form of an old man, not in the form of a warrior. The Valar send Gandalf with instructions to advise, not to command, to assist the free peoples of Middle-earth, not to fight their battles for them. The Valar send the right tool for the job, and the right tool for the job tells you what the job is. The job is not the defeat of a destroyer. The job is the defeat of a controller. Morgoth requires an army. Sauron requires a counselor. The Valar send the host of the West against Morgoth. The Valar send 5 old men against Sauron. The difference in response tells you everything about the difference in threat. Part 40. Their relationship to the ring. The One Ring is the most famous object in fantasy literature. The One Ring is also the clearest demonstration of the difference between Morgoth and Sauron, because the ring is something that Sauron would create and that Morgoth would not. The ring is an investment. The ring is a sacrifice. The ring is the voluntary surrender of personal power in exchange for systemic advantage. The ring requires its maker to give something up, to take a portion of his native strength and place it outside himself, to accept personal diminishment for strategic gain. Morgoth could never have made the ring, not because Morgoth lacks the craft, but because Morgoth lacks the temperament. Morgoth could never voluntarily surrender a portion of his power. Morgoth could never accept personal diminishment for any purpose. Morgoth's nature is acquisitive, is the nature of the being who takes and keeps, who hoards and clutches, who regards every loss of power as an existential threat. Morgoth would never have put his power in a ring, because Morgoth would never have let his power out of his hands. Sauron creates the ring because Sauron understands investment. Sauron understands that spending now can produce returns later. Sauron understands that reducing his personal power can increase his systemic power, that giving up a portion of his native strength can produce an instrument that multiplies his control 100-fold. Sauron thinks like a strategist. Sauron thinks like an investor. Sauron thinks like a being who can calculate costs and benefits across centuries, and who can accept short-term loss for long-term gain. The ring is the product of a mind that Morgoth does not possess. The ring is the product of patience, of calculation, of the kind of strategic thinking that requires a being to suppress his immediate desires in favor of his long-term objectives. The ring is Sauron's character made physical, is the tangible expression of everything that separates Sauron from Morgoth. Everything that makes Sauron a different kind of Dark Lord operating in a different kind of darkness. Part 41. Tolkien's Two Evils. Tolkien is writing about two kinds of evil. Tolkien is not merely telling two stories about two villains. Tolkien is making a philosophical argument, is demonstrating that evil operates in fundamentally different modes, that the will to destroy and the will to dominate are not the same will, that the response to destruction must be different from the response to domination. Morgoth is the evil of the abyss, the evil that reaches up from below, that pulls things down into darkness, that seeks to reduce everything to nothing. Morgoth is entropy. Morgoth is the second law of thermodynamics given consciousness and malice, the force that degrades, that decays, that runs the clock down, that moves everything toward chaos and dissolution. Sauron is the evil of the machine, the evil that reaches down from above, that imposes order on chaos, that seeks to reduce everything to a single pattern. Sauron is the totalitarian state. Sauron is the bureaucracy given consciousness and will, the force that organizes, that categorizes, that eliminates variation, that moves everything toward uniformity and control. Both evils are real. Both evils exist in the world that Tolkien inhabited. Tolkien, the veteran of the Somme, knew the evil of destruction, knew the abyss, knew the meaningless annihilation that modern warfare could produce. Tolkien, the citizen of the 20th century, knew the evil of control, knew the totalitarian state, knew the machine that reduced individuals to components, knew the system that valued efficiency over humanity. Tolkien is not writing allegory. Tolkien would insist on this point, but Tolkien is writing applicability, is creating a mythology that can be applied to the evils of the real world, that provides a framework for understanding the different shapes that evil takes and the different responses that each shape requires. Morgoth is the evil that cannot be reasoned with. Sauron is the evil that reasons too well. Morgoth is the evil that can only be stopped by force. Sauron is the evil that can be stopped by the refusal to participate, the destruction and the system, the chaos and the order, the two faces of evil and the two different kinds of courage required to oppose them. Part 42. Why Sauron is scarier. Let me say something controversial. Sauron is scarier than Morgoth. Morgoth is frightening in the way that a natural disaster is frightening, in the way that an earthquake or a volcano or a meteor strike is frightening. Morgoth is vast and destructive and overwhelming and impersonal. Morgoth's evil is spectacular, is the destruction of the two trees, the breeding of dragons, the breaking of continents. Morgoth's evil is impressive. Morgoth's evil is cinematic. But Morgoth's evil is also recognizable. Morgoth's evil announces itself. Morgoth's evil wears a dark crown and sits on a dark throne in a dark fortress and commands dark armies. You know what Morgoth is. You can see what Morgoth is. You can point at Angband and say, that is the enemy, that is where the evil lives, that is the thing we need to fight. You know where you stand with Morgoth. You know the enemy. You can prepare for the enemy. You can build walls and forge swords and raise armies and point them at the dark fortress and say, march. Sauron is scarier because Sauron can be anyone. Sauron can sit next to you in the workshop and offer you help with your project. Sauron can stand at the king's side and whisper counsel that sounds wise and feels true and leads, step by careful step, toward catastrophe. Sauron can give you a gift, a beautiful, powerful, genuinely useful gift, and the gift can be the mechanism of your enslavement. Sauron is scarier because Sauron's evil looks like good. Sauron's evil looks like order. Sauron's evil looks like efficiency, like progress, like the rational arrangement of the world according to a sound design. Sauron's evil does not announce itself. Sauron's evil disguises itself, wears the mask of benevolence, speaks the language of improvement, presents itself as the solution to the problems that it has created. Celebrimbor does not know he is working with Sauron, the greatest elven smith of the Second Age, a being of extraordinary intelligence and perception, the grandson of Fëanor himself, does not recognize the enemy sitting across the workbench. The elves of Eregion do not know they are forging the instruments of their own domination. The smiths do not know that the beautiful teacher with the golden hair and the generous spirit is the most dangerous being in Middle-earth. Sauron's disguise fools the elves. If Sauron's disguise can fool the elves, imagine what Sauron's disguise could do to us. Morgoth is the villain you can see. Sauron is the villain you can't see until it's too late. Morgoth attacks your body. Sauron attacks your mind. Morgoth destroys your city. Sauron takes your freedom so gradually that you don't notice it's gone until the chains are already locked. This is why the Lord of the Rings is more terrifying than the Silmarillion, not because Sauron is more powerful than Morgoth, but because Sauron's evil is more insidious. The ring does not look like evil. The ring looks like opportunity. The ring feels like empowerment. The ring promises everything you want and takes everything you are, and the taking feels like giving until the moment when the wraith appears and the king is gone, and the hollow thing that remains cannot remember what it was to be free. Part 43. The Moment of Repentance. Sauron has a moment of repentance. Morgoth does not. This single fact tells you more about the difference between them than any analysis of their powers or their methods. After the War of Wrath, after the Valar defeat Morgoth and cast him into the void, Enwë summons the remaining servants of Morgoth and commands them to submit to the judgment of the Valar. Most refuse. Some flee. Sauron alone considers the offer seriously. Tolkien tells us that Sauron's repentance is genuine, at least in part. Sauron is genuinely ashamed. Sauron genuinely recognizes the scale of what he has done. Sauron genuinely considers the possibility of returning to the Valar, submitting to their judgment, accepting the consequences of his actions, and beginning the long process of rehabilitation. This moment is extraordinary. This moment is the moment when Sauron is most different from Morgoth, when the gap between them yawns widest, when the distinction between the two Dark Lords is sharpest and clearest. Sauron, the servant of Morgoth, the lieutenant of the first Dark Lord, the being who has participated in centuries of evil, Sauron stands at the crossroads and genuinely considers turning back. Sauron is capable of shame. This is remarkable. This is the detail that separates Sauron from Morgoth more completely than any difference in power or method or ambition. Morgoth is not capable of shame. Morgoth does not recognize the wrongness of his actions. Morgoth does not feel the weight of his crimes. Morgoth's pride is so total, so absolute, so completely identified with his sense of self that the concept of wrongdoing is literally incomprehensible to Morgoth. Morgoth cannot be ashamed because Morgoth cannot conceive of himself as wrong. Sauron can conceive of himself as wrong. Sauron can feel the gap between what he has done and what he should have done. Sauron can recognize the moral dimension of his actions, can see his crimes as crimes, can understand that the path he has chosen is a fallen path. This capacity for self-awareness, this ability to stand outside himself and see his actions for what they are, is the capacity that makes Sauron both more sympathetic and more culpable than Morgoth. And Sauron rejects the repentance anyway. Sauron feels the shame and chooses to continue rather than to submit. The choice is not the choice of a being incapable of moral understanding. The choice is the choice of a being who understands perfectly well what he has done, and who is unwilling to accept the humiliation of admitting it. Tolkien tells us that Sauron is unwilling to return, because Sauron cannot bear the thought of the humiliation, cannot bear the idea of standing before the Valar as a penitent, of accepting their judgment, of admitting that his entire life's work was a mistake. The unwillingness is not cosmic pride. The unwillingness is personal shame, is the shame of the professional who has been caught, the administrator who has been exposed, the being who has built a career on a lie, and who cannot face the prospect of admitting the lie to the beings whose approval once mattered most. The difference between Morgoth's evil and Sauron's evil is the difference between moral blindness and moral cowardice. Morgoth cannot see that he is wrong. Sauron can see that he is wrong and chooses to continue anyway. Both are evil. But the evil that knows it is evil and continues, the evil that has the option of turning back and refuses, the evil that sees the light and chooses the darkness, that evil is, in some ways, the more tragic. Part 44. What they leave behind. Morgoth leaves behind a corrupted world. Sauron leaves behind a destroyed system. Morgoth's legacy is Morgoth's ring, is the dispersed corruption that Morgoth has poured into the substance of Arda, the taint in the rock, the poison in the water, the fundamental wrongness that pervades the physical world. Morgoth's legacy is permanent. Morgoth's legacy cannot be undone, cannot be extracted from the world without destroying the world, cannot be reversed by any power short of Ilúvatar himself. Morgoth's legacy is the slow, grinding, permanent diminishment of the world, the fading of beauty, the shortening of lives, the gradual, inexorable decline of all things from their original glory toward the entropy that Morgoth set in motion. Every age is worse than the age before it. Every generation inherits a world slightly more diminished than the world its parents knew. The elves feel this most keenly, feel the fading, feel the weariness, feel the slow drain of vitality that drives them eventually to leave Middle-earth for the Blessed Realm. The fading is Morgoth's legacy. The departure of the elves is Morgoth's legacy. The gradual emptying of the world, the loss of magic, the loss of wonder, the transformation of the enchanted into the mundane, is the long-term consequence of the corruption that Morgoth wove into the foundations of reality. Sauron's legacy is nothing. When the ring is destroyed, Sauron's legacy is gone. The Nazgul fade. The orc armies scatter. Barad-dûrta collapses. The system that Sauron built, the empire, the hierarchy, the network of rings and alliances and intimidations, the system falls apart in moments. Sauron's legacy is as concentrated as Sauron's power, is bound to the ring the way Sauron's will is bound to the ring, and the destruction of the ring destroys everything that Sauron built. The collapse is instantaneous. The collapse is total. The moment the ring melts, Sauron's entire edifice crumbles. Not gradually, not over decades, not through the slow processes of historical change. Instantly, the tower falls. The wraiths shriek and vanish. The armies break. The slaves are freed. Everything that Sauron built collapses because everything that Sauron built was built on the ring, and without the ring there is nothing. No structure. No authority. No system. The efficiency of Sauron's design is the cause of its total destruction, because everything connects to the ring. Losing the ring means losing everything. The irony is that Morgoth, the destroyer, leaves a permanent mark on the world, while Sauron, the builder, leaves nothing. The being who wanted to unmake creation succeeds in permanently scarring it. The being who wanted to order creation is erased so completely that within a generation, the world barely remembers that he existed. The world after Morgoth is a world that has been changed, that bears the marks of Morgoth's corruption, that carries the weight of Morgoth's malice in its very substance. The world after Sauron is a world that has been released, that has been freed from Sauron's control, that has been liberated from the system that Sauron imposed. The world after Morgoth is worse. The world after Sauron is free. Part 45. Why the distinction matters. The distinction between Morgoth and Sauron matters because the distinction is Tolkien's answer to the question, what is evil? If evil is only destruction, if evil is only the will to unmake, the desire to annihilate, the rage against creation, then evil is simple. Evil is the dragon. Evil is the Dark Lord on the Dark Throne. Evil is the thing that burns and breaks and kills. Evil is recognizable. Evil is identifiable. Evil is the thing you can point at and name. But Tolkien knows that evil is not only destruction. Tolkien knows that evil can wear a fair face. Tolkien knows that evil can offer gifts. Tolkien knows that evil can speak in the language of improvement and progress and rational organization. Tolkien knows that the most dangerous evil is not the evil that destroys, but the evil that seduces, the evil that enters through the desire for good, that corrupts through the promise of order, that enslaves through the gift of power. Morgoth is the evil that Tolkien inherited from mythology, the dark god, the rebel angel, the Luciferian figure who defies the Creator and wages war against heaven. Sauron is the evil that Tolkien observed in his own time, the totalitarian, the organizer, the being who promises a better world and delivers a cage. Morgoth belongs to the mythological past. Sauron belongs to the modern present. And this is why The Lord of the Rings, the story of Sauron's defeat, resonates with modern readers in a way that the Silmarillion, the story of Morgoth's defeat, sometimes does not. Not because Sauron's story is better told, but because Sauron's evil is more recognizable. Modern readers have seen Sauron. Modern readers have encountered the being who promises order and delivers tyranny, who offers gifts that bind, who builds systems that serve the builder and enslave everyone else. Modern readers have not seen Morgoth. Modern readers have not encountered the primal rebel, the cosmic destroyer, the being who hates existence itself. Morgoth is a myth. Sauron is a memory. And memory is always more frightening than myth. Part 46. The shape of their wars. Even the wars they fight have different shapes. Morgoth's wars are apocalyptic. Every major battle of the First Age is a cataclysm, a world-altering event that reshapes the landscape, that sinks landmasses, that breaks continents. The Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, is a wall of fire that erupts from Angband and destroys the siege that the Noldor have maintained for centuries. The Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, is a defeat so total, so comprehensive, so annihilating that the Noldor never recover from it. The War of Wrath breaks Beleriand itself, sinks the entire subcontinent beneath the sea, reshapes the geography of the world, produces physical changes to the planet that persist for the rest of recorded history. Morgoth's wars break the world. Morgoth's wars are not fought within the world, they are fought against the world, against the substance of reality, against the physical structures that contain and sustain life. When Morgoth's wars end, the map changes. The land changes. The planet itself is different. Sauron's wars do not break the world. Sauron's wars are fought within the world, are fought on the world's terms, within the world's geography, according to the world's rules. The War of the Ring is devastating. The War of the Ring produces sieges and battles and suffering on a vast scale. But the War of the Ring does not sink continents. The War of the Ring does not reshape the planet. The War of the Ring is a war between nations, a political and military conflict fought by armies on battlefields, producing the kind of destruction that wars between nations produce. Sauron fights the way a nation fights. Morgoth fights the way a natural disaster strikes. Sauron's destruction is targeted, is aimed at specific enemies, designed to achieve specific objectives, calibrated to produce specific results. Morgoth's destruction is indiscriminate, is the wholesale devastation of everything, the destruction of friend and foe alike, the annihilation that does not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. The difference between targeted and indiscriminate destruction is the difference between evil that seeks to control and evil that seeks to destroy. Sauron destroys as a means to an end. Morgoth destroys as an end in itself. Part 47. Saruman's Choice. Saruman illuminates the difference between Morgoth and Sauron, because Saruman's fall is a fall into Sauron's kind of evil, not Morgoth's. Saruman does not fall into nihilism. Saruman does not fall into the desire to destroy the world. Saruman falls into the desire to control the world, into the desire for order, for system, for the rational arrangement of Middle-earth according to Saruman's design. Saruman's fall is Sauron's fall repeated, is the fall of the brilliant mind that loves order so much that it will enslave the world to achieve it. Saruman builds Isengard into a military-industrial complex. Saruman creates the Uruk-hai, a new, improved breed of orc, stronger, faster, more disciplined, able to tolerate sunlight. Saruman deforests the area around Isengard to fuel his war machine. Saruman's evil is the evil of the factory, the evil of the system that consumes nature and produces weapons, that transforms the organic into the mechanical, that replaces the living with the functional. Saruman's fall is also personal in a way that echoes Sauron's. Saruman is sent to Middle-earth as one of the Astari, one of the 5 wizards, one of the Maiar dispatched by the Valar to oppose Sauron's influence. Saruman is the head of the order. Saruman is the wisest, the most learned, the most deeply versed in the lore of the rings and the ways of the enemy. Saruman is supposed to advise. Saruman is supposed to counsel. Saruman is supposed to resist. Instead, Saruman falls in the same way that Sauron fell, through the belief that a single directing intelligence could do a better job than the messy, unpredictable process of free collaboration. Saruman studies Sauron. Saruman studies the ring. Saruman studies the methods of the enemy, and the studying becomes the becoming. Saruman does not merely learn from Sauron. Saruman becomes Sauron, becomes a lesser, smaller, more provincial version of the same evil, pursuing the same goals through the same methods on a smaller stage. Saruman's evil is Sauron's evil on a smaller scale. Saruman's evil is the evil of control, the evil that organizes, that manages, that produces results through the efficient application of resources to objectives. Saruman is Sauron without the ring. Saruman is Sauron without patience. Saruman is the demonstration that Sauron's kind of evil can replicate, can spread, can infect other minds, can reproduce itself in beings who were not born evil, but who fall to evil through the desire for order. Morgoth's evil does not replicate this way. No one falls into Morgoth's evil by loving order too much. No one becomes a nihilist through an excess of administrative ambition. Morgoth's evil is singular, is unique to Morgoth, is the product of Morgoth's particular combination of cosmic pride and creative failure. You cannot become Morgoth by wanting the world to work better. You can become Sauron. This replicability is what makes Sauron's evil more dangerous in the long run. Morgoth is a unique threat, a singular being whose evil dies with him. Sauron's evil is a template, a pattern that can be adopted, a model that can be followed, an approach to power that any sufficiently ambitious and sufficiently talented being can pursue. Saruman proves this. Sauron's evil is not merely personal. Sauron's evil is transmissible. Part 48. The Palantry. Sauron's use of the Palantry in the Third Age is a perfect miniature of everything that separates him from Morgoth. Sauron does not destroy the Palantry. Sauron does not take the Seeing Stones and smash them, or hide them, or corrupt them into instruments of destruction. Sauron uses the Palantry as they were designed to be used, as communication devices, as instruments of long-distance observation, as tools for projecting information across vast distances. Sauron takes something that was made for good and turns it to evil, not by destroying it, but by redirecting it, by using it for purposes that its makers never intended, by exploiting its capabilities in ways that serve domination rather than cooperation. Sauron corrupts Saruman through the Palantir. Sauron corrupts Denethor through the Palantir. Sauron does not lie through the Palantir, or rather, Sauron does not need to lie. Sauron shows Saruman and Denethor the truth, shows them his armies, his power, the overwhelming scale of the threat that they face. The truth is the weapon. The truth, carefully selected, strategically presented, deliberately curated to produce despair, the truth is more effective than any lie. Morgoth could never have used the Palantry this way. Morgoth does not understand the concept of curated truth. Morgoth does not understand the idea of showing someone the truth in order to break their will. Morgoth's approach to communication is the approach of the tyrant to the subject. Obey or die. Morgoth does not persuade. Morgoth does not manipulate through information. Morgoth commands, and those who do not obey are destroyed. Sauron commands through information. Sauron's power in the Third Age, the age when Sauron's physical strength is reduced, when Sauron's body is diminished. When the full power of the Second Age is no longer available, Sauron's power in the Third Age is the power of information. Sauron knows things. Sauron sees things. Sauron processes information and uses that information to manipulate events at a distance, to influence decisions in capitals hundreds of miles from Barad-dûrtr, to shape the choices of kings and wizards without ever leaving his tower. Morgoth's power is in his person. Sauron's power is in his network. Morgoth is the strong arm. Sauron is the spider in the web. Two completely different models of power, requiring two completely different responses. Part 49. Gollum is the proof that Sauron and Morgoth are nothing alike. Gollum is the product of Sauron's evil, the product of the ring, the product of the system that Sauron created, the product of the instrument that Sauron designed. Gollum is not the product of physical corruption. Gollum is not transformed the way that elves are transformed into orcs, is not physically remade, is not surgically or magically altered from one species into another. Gollum is corrupted from the inside, is changed by the ring's influence on his will, by the ring's gradual, patient, relentless pressure on his mind, by the slow erosion of his identity and his autonomy under the weight of the ring's desire. Gollum begins as Sméagol, a hobbit, a person, a being with a name and a family and a place in the world. Sméagol has a kinsman called Daggle. Smaugl and Daegul go fishing together on Smaugul's birthday. Daegul finds the ring. And Smaugl kills Daegul for the ring, murders his own relative, his fishing companion, on a riverbank on a birthday morning. Because the ring has already begun its work. Because the desire that the ring produces is immediate and overwhelming and irresistible. The murder is Sauron's evil in miniature. The murder is not the act of a monster. The murder is the act of a person who has been exposed to an irresistible force. A force that targets his desires, that amplifies his weaknesses, that converts his ordinary hobbit appetites into murderous compulsions. Smaugl does not kill Daegul because Smaugl is evil. Smaugl kills Daegul because the ring has made the ordinary extraordinary, has taken the common desire for shiny, beautiful things and amplified it into a desire so vast that it overrides every moral restraint. The ring does not destroy Smaugul's body. The ring destroys Smaugul's self, destroys his identity, his relationships, his ability to connect with other beings. The ring replaces Smaugl with Gollum, with the obsessive, the addict, the creature who has surrendered everything for the sake of the precious, and who no longer remembers what he surrendered. Morgoth's victims are orcs, are beings whose bodies have been twisted beyond recognition, whose physical forms have been permanently altered, whose external appearance announces their corruption. Morgoth's corruption is visible. Morgoth's corruption is undeniable. You look at an orc and you see what Morgoth has done. Sauron's victims are Gollum, are beings whose bodies look mostly the same, whose external appearance has changed only gradually, whose corruption is internal and invisible and detectable only by the sharp-eyed and the wise. You look at Gollum, and you see a wretched creature. You do not immediately see the hobbit underneath. You do not immediately understand that Gollum was a person once, that the creature crouching in the dark, clutching its precious, was once a being who laughed and ate and fished with his cousin in the river. And here is the most devastating detail. Smaugl is still in there. Underneath Gollum, buried beneath centuries of corruption, diminished almost to nothing, Smaugl is still present. Frodo and Sam see him. Frodo appeals to him. The scene on the stairs of Cirith Ungol when Gollum almost repents, when the creature almost reaches out to the sleeping Frodo with something like tenderness. That scene is the proof that Sauron's corruption does not destroy the person. Sauron's corruption imprisons the person, locks the original self inside a cage of compulsion and addiction, keeps the victim alive and aware and suffering inside the shell that the ring has built. Morgoth's corruption kills the person. Sauron's corruption keeps the person alive in order to torture them. The orc does not remember being an elf. Gollum remembers being Smaugl. Which is crueler? Which is worse? Which kind of evil produces more suffering? The evil that destroys, or the evil that preserves in order to enslave? The difference between the orc and Gollum is the difference between Morgoth and Sauron. The monster and the addict. The thing that was unmade and the person who was consumed. The visible horror and the invisible tragedy. Part 50. The concept of worship. Morgoth demands worship. Sauron rarely does, and when Sauron does introduce worship, it is Morgoth worship, not Sauron worship. Morgoth's demand for worship is the demand of the failed god, is the insistence of the being who wanted to be Ilúvatar and who has settled for being worshipped as a substitute. Morgoth wants the elves and the men to bow to him, wants them to acknowledge his supremacy, to offer him the reverence that belongs to the Creator, to treat him as the ultimate authority, even though his authority is stolen and his divinity is a lie. Sauron does not demand worship for himself. Sauron demands obedience. The distinction is crucial. Worship is about the worshipped, is about the aggrandizement of the god, is about the elevation of the worshipped being to a position of spiritual supremacy. Obedience is about the system, is about the functioning of the hierarchy, is about the execution of commands and the maintenance of order. Sauron does not need his subjects to believe in him. Sauron needs his subjects to obey him. The difference between belief and obedience is the difference between Morgoth and Sauron. When Sauron introduces worship in Mennar, Sauron introduces Morgoth worship, establishes a cult of Morgoth, builds a temple to Morgoth, offers sacrifices to Morgoth. Sauron does not set himself up as the object of worship. Sauron sets Morgoth up as the object of worship, and Sauron installs himself as the priest, the intermediary, the being who controls access to the god. The move is brilliant. The move is pure Sauron. Sauron uses Morgoth as a tool, uses his former master's name and reputation as a mechanism of control, uses the idea of Morgoth as a framework within which to exercise power. Sauron does not need to be worshipped. Sauron needs to be the one who controls the worship, the one who stands between the god and the worshipper, the one who interprets the god's will, the one who decides what the god demands. Morgoth wants to be the center of attention. Sauron wants to be the center of power. The center of attention is visible, is exposed, is vulnerable, is the target that every enemy can identify and aim at. The center of power is hidden, is behind the throne, is in the shadows, is the force that moves events without being seen. Part 51. The personal and the systemic. Let me crystallize the difference one final way. Morgoth's evil is personal. Every act of Morgoth's evil is an act of Morgoth, is a direct expression of Morgoth's will, a personal output of Morgoth's consciousness, a thing that Morgoth does because Morgoth is who Morgoth is. Morgoth's evil requires Morgoth. Without Morgoth, without the directing consciousness, without the divine will, without the fallen god sitting on the Iron Throne, Morgoth's evil stops. The orcs scatter. The Balrogs retreat. The dragons sleep. Morgoth's evil is as personal as Morgoth's hatred, and when Morgoth is removed, the hatred is removed with him. Sauron's evil is systemic. Sauron's evil operates through systems, through the rings, through the Nazgul, through the administrative hierarchy, through the network of alliances and intimidations and bribes and threats that extend Sauron's control across Middle-earth. Sauron's evil does not require Sauron's constant personal attention. Sauron's evil operates automatically, runs itself, sustains itself, perpetuates itself through the mechanisms that Sauron has designed, and that function independently of Sauron's moment-to-moment involvement. The Nazgul operate without orders. The ring corrupts without commands. The fear that Sauron generates persists in his absence. The system runs. The system was designed to run. The system is the product of a mind that understands that the best system is the system that operates without its designer. That the best machine is the machine that runs when the mechanic is not in the room. This is what makes Sauron the more modern villain. Sauron's evil is the evil of the system, the evil that persists in the absence of the evil person, the evil that has been coded into the structure, the evil that operates through processes and incentives and institutional arrangements rather than through the personal will of a single being. Sauron is the villain whose evil survives his absence, survives it for 1,000 years, in fact, during the period when Sauron is a formless shadow and the ring lies at the bottom of the Anduin. The ring is still corrupting. The Nazgul are still waiting. The system is still running. Morgoth's evil dies with Morgoth. Sauron's evil persists without Sauron. the personal and the systemic, the king and the machine. Part 52. Why fans confuse them. Fans confuse Morgoth and Sauron because fans see the surface and miss the structure. The surface looks similar. Two Dark Lords, two dark fortresses, two armies of orcs, two campaigns of domination, two confrontations with the forces of good, two defeats. The surface features are similar enough that the casual reader, the reader who watches the movies and skims the Silmarillion and has a general sense of who these beings are, can be forgiven for thinking that Morgoth and Sauron are variations on a theme. The movies reinforce the confusion. The movies present Sauron as a spectacle, as a giant flaming eye, as a dark armored figure, as a force of overwhelming physical power. The movies make Sauron look like Morgoth. The movies strip away Sauron's most distinctive quality, his subtlety, his deceptiveness, his ability to seduce and manipulate, and replace it with the visual language of pure destruction. Movie Sauron is Morgoth wearing different armor. Book Sauron is a completely different being. Tolkien himself understood that the two Dark Lords could be confused, understood that readers might miss the distinction that he had so carefully constructed. This is one reason why Tolkien spent so much time in his letters and his later writings explicating the difference. Why Tolkien wrote detailed philosophical analyses of Morgoth's dispersal and Sauron's concentration. Why Tolkien spelled out the difference between the will to destroy and the will to dominate. Why Tolkien took such care to distinguish the darkness from the machine. But the structure is completely different. The Dark Lord who pours himself into the world is not the same as the Dark Lord who pours himself into a ring. The Dark Lord who fights in person is not the same as the Dark Lord who fights through proxies. The Dark Lord who cannot disguise himself is not the same as the Dark Lord whose greatest weapon is disguise. The Dark Lord who demands worship is not the same as the Dark Lord who demands obedience. The Dark Lord who is defeated by an army is not the same as the Dark Lord who is defeated by a hobbit. The confusion is understandable. The confusion is also damaging, because the confusion obscures Tolkien's deepest insight about evil, which is that evil is not monolithic. The confusion flattens the complexity of Tolkien's moral vision, reduces the two most carefully constructed villains in fantasy literature to big bad and slightly smaller bad, when the actual relationship between them is a philosophical argument about the different shapes that evil takes and the different responses that each shape demands. Part 53. The final contrast. Let me leave you with the image that captures everything. Morgoth sits on his throne in the deepest pit of Angband, clutching the Silmarils, wounded by Fingolfin, afraid of the Noldor, surrounded by monsters, waiting for the armies of the Valar to come and drag him into the void. Morgoth is alone. Morgoth is surrounded by servants, but Morgoth is alone, is the loneliest being in the world. The being who rejected community, who rejected collaboration, who rejected the shared creation of the music, and chose instead to sing his own theme. Morgoth's throne room is the image of cosmic loneliness, the image of the being who wanted to be God, and who discovered that the price of playing God is playing alone. The dark crown burns his brow. The Silmarils burn in the iron. The most powerful being in the history of creation sits in a hole in the ground, afraid to come out, clutching stolen jewels that cause him pain, waiting for the end that he knows is coming. This is what the desire to be Ilvatar produces, a god who is less than the least of the beings he sought to dominate. Sauron is not alone. Sauron is connected, is linked, is networked, is woven into the fabric of Middle-earth through the rings and the Palantri and the Nazgul and the 1,000 threads of influence that extend from Barad-dûrka to the far corners of the continent. Sauron is the spider at the center of the web, the intelligence that processes the vibrations, that reads the signals, that responds to the movements of every creature caught in the strands. Sauron's tower is not lonely. Sauron's tower is the hub of a network, is the center of a system, is the processing unit of a machine that encompasses the entire world. The lonely god and the connected tyrant. The being who stands apart from creation, and the being who embeds himself in creation. The being who hates the world and the being who wants to own it. The being who diminishes by scattering himself across the cosmos, and the being who diminishes by concentrating himself in a ring. Two dark lords. Two forms of evil. Two completely different beings who happen to share a title and a history and a capacity for destruction. They are nothing alike. They were never anything alike. And the difference between them is the most important thing about them, is the key that unlocks Tolkien's moral philosophy, is the insight that elevates Tolkien's mythology from fantasy into something approaching wisdom. Part 54. The Darkness and the Machine. Tolkien once wrote, in a letter, that his mythology contained two primary enemies, the darkness and the machine. The darkness, Tolkien said, was the enemy that sought to annihilate, to reduce the world to nothing, to return creation to the void from which it came. The machine was the enemy that sought to control, to impose a single will on the diversity of the world, to replace the living with the mechanical, the free with the enslaved, the organic with the designed. The darkness is Morgoth. The machine is Sauron. Tolkien spent his life writing about these two enemies, spent decades constructing a mythology that explored their natures, their methods, their failures, and the different kinds of courage required to oppose them. Tolkien understood that the darkness and the machine are not the same threat. Tolkien understood that the response to nihilism is not the same as the response to totalitarianism. Tolkien understood that the army that defeats Morgoth is not the same as the fellowship that defeats Sauron. The army defeats the darkness, because the darkness can only be confronted with force, because nihilism does not listen, does not negotiate, does not respond to anything except the overwhelming application of power against power. The Fellowship defeats the machine because the machine can be short-circuited by the one thing it cannot account for, the free act, the unpredictable choice, the small being who walks into the fire with no power and no plan and no expectation of survival, and who destroys the system by refusing to participate in it. Two enemies, two evils, two dark lords. Nothing alike. Morgoth is the darkness before the dawn. Sauron is the machine that prevents the dawn from mattering. Morgoth is the absence of light. Sauron is the control of light, the being who does not extinguish the lamp, but who decides who gets to see by it. Morgoth wants the world to end. Sauron wants the world to obey. One is a catastrophe. The other is a cage. And the world that Tolkien built, the world of hobbits and elves and rangers and wizards, the world of the Shire and Rivendell and Lothlorien and the Crack of Doom, that world requires both kinds of courage to survive. The courage that stands against the darkness, and the courage that refuses the machine. Thank you for walking through the darkness and the machine with me tonight. Until next time.